Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles in like a soft blanket, and the mysteries of the past unfold slowly enough to dream through. Tonight's quiet journey takes us far from the noise of the modern world and deep into the dust and silence of ancient stone. We're going to drift across ages and continents, following the traces of the Anunnaki, the gods who, according to some of humanity's oldest stories, came down from the heavens to build temples that touched the stars. Some say those temples were more than places of worship. They were bridges, gates, or even machines. Portals, perhaps, between Earth and something far beyond. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That beneath all our cities, under layers of time and soil, might lie the remnants of structures built not just for men to climb, but for gods to descend. So before we begin, take a slow breath. Feel the weight of the day ease away. Maybe you're lying in bed, the lights dim, the world shrinking to a single calm moment. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere quiet, perhaps, or under a city sky where ancient constellations still watch faintly through the glow of lamps. If you find these stories soothing or even a little mesmerizing, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed so that more travellers might find their way to this quiet corner of history. Now, let's begin. Because long before maps, before machines and measurements, humans built temples that seemed to imitate the heavens. And somewhere between heaven and stone, a story began that still hums in the earth. The oldest records we have from Sumer speak of the Anunnaki as beings who descended from the sky to establish order on earth. They were not distant or silent gods. They lived among their creation, taught humans to plant, measure, count, and build. And when they built up, piling clay upon clay into towers that seemed to lean toward the sky. The Sumerians didn't call these temples symbols or myths. They called them houses of the gods, places where the divine could rest, eat, and appear before those who served them. To a modern eye, the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia look like staircases frozen mid-ascent, giant steps cut into the earth as if someone had begun climbing toward the stars and stopped halfway. The city of Eridu, according to ancient lists, was the first city ever built. The texts say it was founded by the gods themselves before kingship descended to men. At its heart stood a temple, small at first, then rebuilt again and again over centuries, each layer a little higher, a little grander, as if humanity kept trying to reach a place it could only half remember. The clay bricks were stamped with symbols of the sky, the sun, the planets, and above all the names of those who ruled from beyond them. Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the host of divine beings who shaped both heaven and earth. Archaeologists see mud brick foundations, eroded mounds and broken altars. But the Sumerians saw something very different. To them, the temple was not a monument to the gods, it was a place where gods were. The Sumerian word for temple, Ekur, means literally mountain house, the dwelling of heaven on earth. And perhaps when you imagine the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, the idea of a man-made mountain makes sense. There were no natural peaks there, nothing tall enough to touch the sky, so they built their own. Every city, they said, was a reflection of a heavenly one. Nippur was the earthly mirror of the god's city above. Mirrored the heavens of Nana, the moon god. Each temple stood as a bridge between worlds. When the priests climbed those staircases at dawn to offer incense and chants, they weren't simply praying upward. They were enacting an ancient ritual of connection. The scent of burning cedar was meant to rise as a signal, a message. The smoke was not just offering, it was communication. To them the air shimmered with presence, and the very stones of the temple carried resonance, as if sound itself could open invisible doors. Every civilization that followed seemed to inherit that same instinct. Egypt, with its pyramids angled toward the stars, the Maya, with temples built to mark equinoxes, the megalithic builders of Europe aligning stones with solstices. Across thousands of miles and millennia, humans kept building places that seemed to point upward. that framed the heavens like portals waiting to open. It's easy to call it coincidence, but when you stand at the base of an ancient ziggurat and trace its worn steps with your eyes, it feels less like imitation and more like remembrance, as if somewhere, buried in our oldest memory, we recall a time when gods walked the earth and needed a place to return to. Ancient texts hint that these places were more than ceremonial. The Temple of Enki at Eridu, for example, was said to hold the Mi, sacred tablets of power that govern civilization itself, laws, crafts, knowledge, destiny. When the myths speak of the gods leaving the earth, they also speak of their temples falling silent, the gates closed, the connection severed. Humanity kept rebuilding the structures, but the voices within grew faint, and yet the shapes endured, the stepped towers, the sacred courtyards, the central altars. It's as though people remembered not just what to build, but why. Some modern researchers look at the layout of these ancient sites and see something uncanny, a geometry that repeats across continents, ratios of height to base, alignments to solstices, the orientation of doorways to particular stars, patterns that suggest not just random design, but intent. The Sumerians didn't have compasses or GPS, yet they built structures so precisely aligned that their corners still match celestial coordinates thousands of years later. It's as though their temples were calibrated, like instruments tuned to some cosmic rhythm we no longer hear. There are stories, of course, that push these mysteries further. Some claim that the Anunnaki temples were not just sacred sites, but machines, gateways that harnessed energy from the earth and sky. The ziggurats, they say, were designed not only for ceremony but for resonance. The stepped design may have amplified certain frequencies, the materials may have interacted with magnetic fields, and the rituals, chants, fire, incense, may have served as activation, aligning the human and the divine like two sides of the same signal. It sounds impossible. Yet when you stand before ancient ruins and feel the low hum of the wind passing through stone, it's hard not to sense something alive there. Even the word temple might carry echoes of this. In Latin, templum referred to a sacred space cut out of the ordinary world, a section of sky or ground marked for communion. To make a temple was to define a portal, a space where heaven and earth could touch. It's an idea that transcends language. In Sumerian, Egyptian, Sanskrit, even in the old tongues of the Americas, sacred architecture was never just shelter, it was connection. The builders weren't only engineers, they were mediators between realms. Imagine the scene thousands of years ago, the dawn just breaking over the plains of Mesopotamia. A procession of priests climbing the temple stairs, robes catching the wind, carrying offerings of oil, grain and honey. The air thick with incense and chants in a language that has not been spoken aloud in thousands of years. The first light of the sun strikes the gilded top of the ziggurat, turning the clay steps to fire. Below, farmers and traders bow their heads, knowing that somewhere above them, maybe far above, the gods are watching. The world feels ordered. The gate is open. The rhythm of heaven and earth is in harmony. That moment, whether you believe it was symbolic or real, became the model for all sacred architecture to come. Every arch, every steeple, every sanctuary that reaches upward carries that same ancient memory. The hope that somewhere between stone and sky, a path to the divine still exists. As the centuries passed, floods buried cities, empires rose and fell, and languages turned to dust. But the story of the Anunnaki temples never quite faded. It lingered in myths, in clay tablets, in the strange persistence of a particular shape. The stepped pyramid, the mountain temple, the sanctuary aligned to the stars. And every time someone uncovered another ruin, or another story of gods descending in flame or light, the old question returned. Were these places merely symbols of faith, or were they once something more? In the stillness of ruins like Ur or Eridu, the mind begins to wander. The stones seem to hum faintly with warmth after sunset, as if holding on to the day's memory. Birds nest in the cracks, the wind moves through corridors once filled with chanting, and the desert settles back around what was once the heart of a civilization. You can almost imagine, just for a moment, that the air itself still remembers. Maybe the energy that ancient priests once called down hasn't vanished entirely. Maybe it only waits, dormant, woven into the dust and silence of the earth. The idea of temples as stargates might sound like modern invention, born of science fiction and ancient astronaut theories. But it reflects something profoundly human, the desire to connect with something beyond ourselves, to build a bridge between the finite and the infinite. The Anunnaki story, whether myth or memory, captures that longing perfectly. Gods descending from the sky, teaching humanity, then retreating, leaving us to search for their return. The temples remain like beacons, patient, waiting for their purpose to be rediscovered. And so our journey begins among these ancient stones, tracing the echoes of builders who might have known more than we do now about the meeting point between heaven and earth. From the sands of Mesopotamia to the jungles of Mesoamerica, from the forgotten plains of Anatolia to the high plateaus of the Andes, we'll follow the quiet hum of old stones and wonder what they were really built for. Whether they were stargates, sanctuaries, or something in between, they still stand, whispering the same silent invitation. Look up. Because somewhere in those forgotten temples, where stone meets sky, the story of the gods who came down is still waiting to be heard again. They said the gods came down in the days when the rivers were young, when the air was thick with the smell of rain and clay, and the first cities were no more than patches of mud brick rising from the floodplain. The stories begin not with people, but with sky, because in Sumer everything began above. The heavens were not distant. They were alive, inhabited, full of order and light. The word Anunnaki itself means those who came from heaven to earth, and for the people who carved their names into wet clay, that was not poetry, it was lineage. The world they lived in had been arranged by hands that did not belong to mortals. According to the oldest tablets, when the earth was still covered in water and marsh, the gods descended to bring shape and measure. They divided the sky from the sea, marked the courses of rivers, and named the stars that would guide the turning of the year. They chose places to stand and called them centres of power. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. Cities that, according to the Sumerian king list, existed before the flood. Each had a ruler, each a temple, and each a purpose. Together they formed the pattern of a civilization said to have been taught by the gods themselves. In those myths, Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, was one of the first to arrive. He came to the marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates met and built a sanctuary that glittered like the surface of the sea. That temple became the foundation of Eridu, the first city, the first home of kingship, and perhaps the first attempt at permanence. To the people who built it, Eridu was not merely a settlement. It was the axis between heaven and earth, the place where the divine order descended and spread outward. The clay tablets describe the moment in simple words. Kingship descended from heaven. Those 4 words shaped the belief of an entire civilization. The Anunnaki were not imagined as abstract spirits. They had names, duties, domains, and families. They were described as tall, radiant beings, neither fully human nor entirely beyond understanding. They oversaw the destinies of men, assigned roles to the other gods, and decided which cities would prosper. They were both rulers and architects, and their temples were said to be the points where heaven touched the earth. The Sumerians believed that each god had a home, a house of life, a place where his or her essence was concentrated. These were not metaphors. They were physical structures, built from millions of bricks, decorated with lapis and gold, oriented to the rising of the stars. When you look at the remains of those temples now, eroded and crumbling, it's difficult to imagine what they once were. But the descriptions endure. The Abzu, Enki's temple at Eridu, was said to gleam with copper. Its walls were inscribed with symbols that shimmered in the lamplight. Beneath it, the sacred water of the Abzu, the primeval ocean, was said to flow, a link between the surface world and the unseen depths. In the cool shadow of its halls, priests and scribes recorded rituals that traced their origins back to the Age of the Gods. Archaeologists have uncovered layers upon layers of building at Eridu, each older than the one above. Beneath the ruins of later temples lie foundations that date back over 7,000 years. It is as if every generation, believing itself to be rebuilding what once was divine, laid its bricks over the memory of the last. The temple grew like a geological formation, history compressed into architecture, and always the builders faced it toward the same point on the horizon, where the first light of dawn broke across the marshes. The myths say that the gods taught humans to build, to shape mud into order, to make walls stand against the flood. The ziggurat was not an invention of man alone, but a reflection of the mountain from which the gods first descended. It was a design handed down, a pattern meant to imitate the heavenly realm. In the story of Enlil, the god of wind and authority, his temple at Nippur was said to be built as the bond between heaven and earth. That phrase appears again and again on tablets and seals, the bond, the link, the knot that ties the above to the below. It is almost as if they were describing not only a structure but a network, a system connecting sacred points across the landscape. The people believed the gods moved between these points. Rituals were written to welcome them, to feed them, to ensure they lingered long enough to bless the land. In some accounts, the Anunnaki travelled in luminous vessels that appeared like stars. The word used for these vehicles, mu, has been interpreted by some as a reference to boats, by others as skyships. The texts are fragmentary, but the imagery is persistent. Descent from the sky, columns of light, the meeting of heaven and earth in a chosen place. When the priests recited their hymns, they were not merely praising their gods, they were reenacting the original descent, the moment of arrival. The smoke from the offering fires was described as a stairway for the divine, rising from the altar to the sky. The air itself became a medium of passage. In that sense, every temple was a Stargate, even if the word did not yet exist, a place designed to receive something from beyond. The myths of the creation of humankind also begin at these sites. In the story told on the tablets of Nippur, the gods grew weary of labouring to maintain the world. They complained to Enki and to the mother goddess Ninhursag. The solution, they decided, was to fashion beings who could take on the burden of work. Clay was gathered from near a sacred spring, mixed with divine essence and shaped into forms. When the work was done, the new creature stood upright, capable of speech and service. The place of that creation, according to the text, was near the temples of the Anunnaki, on the edge of the Abzu, where the waters of the underworld rose to the surface. Whether symbolic or literal, that setting matters. The creation of humanity and the construction of the temples are inseparable in the mythology. Both acts represent the meeting of divine and earthly materials. The gods provided spirit, the humans provided form. The temples, built from the same clay as the first humans, were extensions of that union. They were the living body of civilization. In the quiet corridors of those early sanctuaries, the line between myth and memory blurs. Tablets describe processions of priests carrying offerings to rooms that no longer exist. Statues with inlaid eyes once glimmered in the lamplight, fixed on the doorways where visitors entered. Musicians played lyres carved from cedar, and the hum of their strings echoed through halls designed to amplify sound. The architecture itself seems to have been tuned, shaped to resonate with low frequencies that could be felt more than heard. Standing inside one of these spaces, the human body would have vibrated gently, the air alive with sound. It is not difficult to imagine that such sensations could feel divine. Everywhere you look in the record, the same pattern repeats. Temples built near water, structures aligned to the stars, names invoking descent, ascent, connection. It is as though the builders were preserving a blueprint that originated beyond their own history. In later ages, when the Babylonians rebuilt the old Sumerian cities, they kept the same alignments. The Temple of Marduk in Babylon was said to rise where the ancient Ekur once stood. Its top, the ziggurat called Anunnaki, was described as reaching from earth to heaven. The phrase appears almost identical to the one used thousands of years earlier for Enlil's sanctuary. The continuity is remarkable. Across centuries of conquest, language change, and cultural shift, the concept remained untouched. The temple as a vertical connection between realms. Even after the old gods faded, the architecture lingered. The Israelites spoke of Jacob's ladder, a vision of angels ascending and descending between heaven and earth. In Egypt, the pyramid texts describe the pharaoh's journey to the sky, aided by steps of light. In Mesoamerica, temples were called houses of the sky, and priests climbed their stairs to meet the sun. It is tempting to see all of these as variations of the same ancient idea, that somewhere in the deep past the blueprint of a cosmic gate was laid down and remembered. The notion of the Anunnaki as builders spreads quietly through every layer of Mesopotamian myth. They established cities, measured boundaries, taught irrigation, assigned duties to the minor gods, and then withdrew. Yet their temples endured, tended by humans who believed they would one day return. In later texts from Assyria, the king Ashurbanipal claimed to have rediscovered the writings of the Anunnaki and rebuilt their sanctuaries in imitation of the originals. He described himself as he who restores the foundation of the gods. Even in his time, the link between divinity and architecture was seen as sacred inheritance. It's easy, from a modern distance, to see only myth in these stories. But myths are built on memory. They record impressions of real events shaped by imagination and retelling. Perhaps the arrival of the gods was the memory of an encounter with something extraordinary, a civilization older than Sumer, or visitors from faraway lands whose knowledge seemed divine. Perhaps the temples were the way humans tried to keep that contact alive, to recreate the conditions of the first meeting. When you read the tablets describing the descent of the Anunnaki, there's a sense of awe that still reaches across the millennia. The language is formal, reverent, but underneath it is wonder. The writers knew they were describing something beyond ordinary comprehension. They wrote of shining figures clothed in brilliance, of voices that shook the air, of instructions carved into stone. For them, the gods were not unreachable. They had names, faces, and addresses. You could visit their house, bring them offerings, speak to them through ritual. And in that exchange, you found meaning. The story of the gods who came down is, at its heart, a story about humanity learning to build, to take the raw material of the world, mud, water, light, and give it form. The temples were physical proof that knowledge had been passed down from another order of being. Every brick laid upon another was an act of remembrance. Even now the ruins remain like the shadows of a vanished blueprint, silent but eloquent. As night falls over the old plains of Mesopotamia, the stars rise in the same patterns the ancient builders once watched. Orion, the Pleiades, the curve of the Milky Way, all in their places, unchanged. Somewhere among those constellations, they believed, lay the home of the gods. When they looked up from the terraces of their temples, they saw not emptiness, but return. Each star a promise, each beam of light a path home. And if the Anunnaki truly built the first cities, perhaps what they left behind was not only stone and story, but an instinct that still lingers in us. The need to build upward, to reach, to connect heaven and earth through whatever tools we have, stone, light, or thought. The old ziggurats may have crumbled, but the desire they embodied has not. It echoes in the towers of our cities, in observatories pointed to the sky, in every question we ask about where we came from, and who, if anyone, once taught us to look up. Somewhere in that vast sweep of history between myth and archaeology, the gods who came down became part of us. Their temples became our memories, Their blueprints are inheritance, and as we move through the next stories, the sacred mountains, the resonant chambers, the gateways of stone, we'll keep following that quiet thread they left behind, the one that still leads upward toward the stars they once called home. They called it the Mountain of the Gods, not because it was high, but because it reached somewhere that mountains could not. In the flatlands of Mesopotamia there were no peaks, no ridges to pierce the horizon. The land stretched away in every direction, a wide and endless plain cut by rivers, shifting with flood and season. To imagine a mountain, there was to imagine something otherworldly, a rise of clay shaped by divine hands, a stairway for those who did not walk as men did. The Sumerians gave it a name that still feels heavy with reverence: Ekur, the house of the mountain, the bond between heaven and earth. The temple of Enlil at Nippur was its heart. Even when the walls have long since crumbled and the sand has swallowed its foundations, the memory of it remains in the tablets. They describe a structure vast and ordered, where every brick bore a name, where every gate was aligned to a point in the sky. To stand there, they said, was to stand at the centre of the world. The winds that moved across the plains were Enlil's breath, and the voices of the priests were his echoes. Nippur was not the oldest of the cities, but it was the holiest. Kings from every dynasty, from Ur to Babylon, came to its temple to seek legitimacy. Even when the political capital shifted, Nippur stayed sacred. It was believed that Enlil, the lord of air and authority, had decreed the fates of gods and men alike within its halls. In one of the hymns, the temple is called the mooring post of heaven and earth, an image that suggests something far more mechanical than metaphorical. A mooring post is a place where ships tie their ropes, where journeys begin and end. It is an anchor. The Ekur, then, was the anchor of the cosmos, holding the sky in place above the world. If you imagine the temple in its time, you would see not a ruin but a living organism. Courtyards alive with incense and music. Processions winding between columns painted with bright mineral colours. The hum of chanting, the sound of drums marking the rhythm of the stars. At the top of its staircase stood an altar of polished stone, and from there the priests would raise their offerings, watching the smoke twist into the morning air. The ziggurat rose in layers, each narrower than the one below, the colour of baked clay and copper. From a distance, it would have shimmered against the horizon like a mirage. Archaeologists have found remnants of this temple buried beneath the dust of ages. The foundation bricks still bear inscriptions dedicated to Enlil. The orientation of the site points precisely to where the sun rises at the equinox, suggesting that the builders designed it not only as a house of worship, but as a cosmic instrument. The temple mirrored the heavens, mapping divine order onto the earth. The people who lived in its shadow believed that everything within it, the size of its walls, the height of its tower, even the intervals of its gates, reflected patterns set in the stars. In the hymns, Enlil's temple is described as being raised by Anu, the sky god himself. The texts tell that when the Ekur was completed, the gods descended to inspect it, their radiance filling the courts with light. One fragment reads, "Its stairway reaches the sky. Its platform is the seat of destiny." Another calls it the shining place of the tablets of fate. These lines have led some to imagine the temple as a kind of ancient machine, a location where decisions of the cosmos were transmitted, perhaps even recorded. But to the Sumerians, such descriptions were not extraordinary. The divine and the physical were intertwined. To them, a temple was as much a mechanism as a metaphor. There is a recurring pattern in these early myths. The temple is always described as alive. It breathes with the wind, sings with the voice of the priest, gleams like the dawn. It is never static. The rituals performed within its walls were not for remembrance alone. They were meant to maintain the balance of the world. Each prayer, each offering kept the machinery of creation turning. If those acts ceased, so too would harmony. The Ekur was, in essence, the heart of the world's rhythm. It's a humbling thought that somewhere around 4,000 years ago, humans built a structure not only to honour the heavens, but to keep them running. The priests of Nippur believed they were caretakers of that balance. They tended the temple as one might tend a living organism, sweeping its courtyards, repairing its steps, refreshing its sacred fires. Every act, no matter how small, had meaning. To neglect the temple was to invite chaos, the return of the flood, the loss of divine order. Enlil himself was a god of wind and command, invisible yet everywhere. He was said to separate heaven from earth, to assign the destinies of all beings. In a way, he represented the invisible structure of the universe, the rules by which everything moved. The Ekur, his dwelling, embodied that structure in stone. Standing at its base, one might have felt that the building itself was breathing, its staircases channeling the wind, its bricks humming faintly in the heat. The Sumerians wrote that when Enlil spoke from within his house, his words were like thunder rolling over the plains. The sound carried far, and those who heard it felt their hearts tremble. In the old language, the word for temple, also meant house. But it was not just a home for the gods. It was a place where human and divine voices met, where speech itself became sacred. The priest's chants were not simply recitations. They were harmonics meant to resonate with the frequencies of the divine. The idea that vibration could open a channel between worlds is ancient, and it appears here in these earliest of temples already fully formed. Modern researchers have found that certain dimensions of the ziggurats produce low-frequency resonance when wind moves through their upper levels. The chambers amplify specific tones that can be felt in the body. It's easy to imagine how such sensations, combined with ritual and incense, might have created an overwhelming sense of presence. For the participants, the gods were not distant. They were immediate, tangible, woven into the architecture itself. In later ages, the Ekur became a template. Every temple built across Mesopotamia echoed its design. The Babylonians called their ziggurats houses of the foundation of heaven and earth, repeating the same idea under different names. Even the legend of the Tower of Babel carries a faint memory of the Ekur, a human attempt to reach the heavens, to bridge the distance between mortal and divine. The difference was intent. The Ekur was built in harmony with the gods. Babel, the story says, was built in defiance. The punishment was confusion. The moral was clear. Connection requires alignment, not ambition. There are fragments that suggest the Ekur may have had underground chambers as well as towers. The Abzu, the underworld sea, was believed to flow beneath it. In this view, the temple was a complete model of the universe, spanning from the depths to the stars. The gods of heaven were invoked at its summit, while offerings were made below to the spirits of the earth. It was a three-tiered cosmos compressed into a single structure: sky above, world in the middle, underworld below. To walk through its gates was to travel symbolically through creation itself. The language of the hymns reflects that same geometry. They speak of the temple's upper chamber of light and its foundation of deep waters. They describe Enlil's throne as shining like the morning sun and the doorways as guarded by spirits of air. There is rhythm and order in those lines, an echo of the precision with which the temple was built. The question of whether these temples could have served some other, more mysterious purpose has lingered for centuries. Some see in their design the suggestion of energy lines, acoustic chambers, or astronomical devices. The alignments are too consistent to ignore. The staircases rise in precise angles matching the paths of celestial bodies. The central axis points toward the belt of Orion, a constellation that, in Sumerian cosmology, represented the heavenly realm of Anu. The same constellation appears in later Egyptian and Mesoamerican structures. Perhaps coincidence, or perhaps the memory of a shared design carried across oceans of time. When the priests of Nippur performed their rituals, they did so with mathematical precision. The lengths of the offerings, the intervals of the chants, even the timing of the steps up the staircase were dictated by celestial cycles. Every gesture mirrored something in the sky. In a way, they were reenacting the motion of the heavens through human action. To climb the ziggurat was to ascend symbolically through the layers of the cosmos. The top platform exposed to the open air was a meeting place, a flat plain between worlds. Imagine the scene at night, torches flickering against the walls, their smoke twisting into the dark, the sound of drums fading into the distance. Above, the stars wheel in slow majesty. The priests ascend in silence, each carrying a small flame, the light trembling with each step. At the summit they set the lamps around the altar, forming a circle of light against the void. The ritual begins. Words are spoken that have not been spoken in millennia. The air hums faintly. Perhaps, in that moment, it felt as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. Even today, when the wind moves across the ruins of Nippur, there is a strange resonance in the air. The outlines of the ziggurat rise from the sand like the bones of some ancient creature. The bricks, sun-baked and cracked, still bear the faint marks of human hands. You can stand there, feel the heat radiating from the ground, and almost sense the weight of time pressing upward through the soil. The horizon stretches in every direction, and for a moment it's easy to believe that the gods chose this place because there was nowhere higher to go. The Ekur represents a turning point in human history. It marks the moment when architecture became theology, when stone began to speak the language of the sky. The idea that a building could embody cosmic order would ripple outward through all later civilizations. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of India, the sacred mountains of the Andes, all echo the same intuition. To build upward is to honor the source of life. To align with the stars is to find harmony with the forces that govern them. In the tablets, there is a description of Enlil's chariot, a radiant object that descends from the sky to rest upon the temple's summit. It shines like polished bronze and emits a sound described as the roar of 10,000 winds. To the modern reader it is myth. To the Sumerians it was memory. The arrival of the god at his mountain house was an event reenacted each year in ceremony. The priests would raise torches and trumpets, the people would gather below, and for a moment the boundary between heaven and earth would dissolve. That idea, the return of the gods to their earthly dwelling, is woven through the entire Anunnaki narrative. The temples were not just monuments to past presence, they were invitations for future return. Each rebuilding, each restoration, was an act of faith that the connection could be renewed. When later kings repaired the Ekur, they recorded it as a renewal of the covenant between heaven and earth. Even in the last days of Mesopotamia, when empires crumbled and new religions rose, the idea endured. That somewhere beneath the dust lay a place where gods had once stood, and might stand again. The mountain of the gods was more than a building. It was a statement of intent, that the divine could dwell among the mortal, that the unseen could be given form. In the quiet of the ancient night, when the fires burned low and the stars shone bright, the people of Nippur would look to their ziggurat and see not just stone, but a path, a way upward, a reminder that they were not alone in the vastness. And perhaps that is why the story of Ekur still matters. It represents humanity's oldest desire, to reach beyond the visible, to connect the finite with the infinite. The Sumerians built it for Enlil, but in doing so, they built for themselves a ladder of meaning. They turned clay into cosmos. They made the invisible tangible, and though the bricks have fallen, the pattern remains etched into memory, waiting to be rediscovered every time we look to the sky and wonder what might still be watching from above. From the dust of Nippur, the story spreads outward again, to other temples, other echoes of the same design. Across the ancient world, the idea of sacred architecture as a bridge between realms would take root. Each culture would give it new names, new rituals, new symbols, but the purpose remained unchanged. The gods had descended once, and perhaps, in some quiet way, humanity has been rebuilding their landing places ever since. The mountain of the gods may have sunk beneath the earth, but its outline still shapes how we imagine the meeting point of heaven and stone. Its memory lingers in every temple that followed, in every dream of connection that rises from the ground toward the stars. And as the story continues, those echoes will grow louder, resonating through the next places where the divine and the human once met, and where the world itself seemed to hum with the presence of something greater. If the gods spoke in words, their first language must have been light, not the kind that flickers from a torch or glows from fire, but the deeper kind, the light that moves with the stars. In the time when temples were built not for memory but for communication, every stone placed upon another had a meaning, every alignment a phrase. Across the plains of Mesopotamia, the builders of the ziggurats watched the horizon, as if it were a tablet waiting to be written on. The stars that rose above the desert were not distant fires. They were symbols, signs from those who once walked among them, and the temples were their reply. When night settled over Nippur or Eridu, the sky unfolded in astonishing precision. To the priests, the constellations were not just patterns, they were hierarchies of divine order. Each god had a star, each star a path. The heavens were a living archive, a map of power and relationship. In that silent vault above them, the stories of the Anunnaki were written in light, and every ritual mirrored their motion. The temple was not only built for the gods, it was built with the gods, synchronized with their journey across the sky. Long before telescopes, before compasses, before the idea of the Earth as a globe, the Sumerians recorded astronomical observations so detailed they can still be recognized today. They tracked the heliacal rising of Venus, the steady drift of Jupiter, the wandering of Mars. They divided the year into cycles of movement and rest, seasons of the gods' presence and absence. To them, each planet was not a sphere of rock or gas, but a being, one of the heavenly ones, whose paths dictated the rhythm of life below. The priests of the temples became the translators of that language, reading the sky as if it were scripture. Each temple had a function not just in worship but in observation. The upper platform served as places to study the horizon, to mark where stars appeared and vanished. When the first glimmer of Venus rose before dawn, it was the signal to begin certain rites. When the moon reached its highest point, another ceremony began. These patterns were woven into daily life, and the builders encoded them into stone. The orientation of doors, the slope of staircases, the width of corridors, all spoke a quiet geometry of devotion. In this way, architecture became language. The Anunnaki temples were not just monuments, they were instruments of calibration, built to align earth with heaven. The priests who tended them did not only guard relics, they maintained synchronization. Every morning and evening, every solstice and equinox, they adjusted rituals to the rhythm of the sky, as if tuning a vast invisible mechanism. For them, time itself was divine, not a line but a circle that turned endlessly, each revolution reaffirming that the bond between heaven and earth still held. If you stand now among the ruins of those old cities, you can still trace the pattern. The axis of Eridu's temple points to the rising of Sirius, the bright star associated with divinity and renewal. The ziggurat of Ur aligns almost perfectly with the equinox sunrise, its shadow falling evenly along both sides at the exact moment the day and night share their balance. These details, measured and repeated across sites separated by centuries, speak of a precision that defies coincidence. Someone was watching the stars very carefully, and their intention was not to decorate but to communicate. The same principle appears again in later civilizations. The pyramids of Egypt face the cardinal points with a perfection that modern instruments still marvel at. The temple complexes of Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza in Mesoamerica mark the turning of the sun in exact measure. Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the temples of Malta, all share the same fascination with alignment, as though every culture in its own language was responding to the same call from above. Perhaps the knowledge was shared, or perhaps it was remembered. Either way, the stars seem to have taught humanity the art of geometry long before mathematics was written down. In Sumerian belief, the sky was divided into 3 realms, each ruled by a principal god. The northern heavens belong to Enlil, the central band to Anu, and the southern to Enki. This division appears again in the way their temples were distributed, not randomly, but according to a pattern that mirrors that celestial order. The cities aligned with the stars of their patron deities, their boundaries set by the geometry of heaven itself. To walk from one temple to another was symbolically to travel across the heavens. The builders must have known the importance of proportion. The ziggurat, rising in stages, was both a mountain and a model of the cosmos. Its base represented the earth, its summit the sky. The central stairway, connecting them, was the pathway of the gods, the literal translation of the name Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. Every brick placed along that stairway was part of a conversation. When the priests ascended to make offerings, they were retracing the descent of the divine, answering heaven with gesture and ritual. The mathematics of these structures hint at knowledge older than a recorded history. The Sumerian system of numbers based on 60 still shapes our world today. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That base of 60 was not arbitrary. It was a reflection of celestial cycles, the paths of Jupiter and Saturn, the revolutions of the moon, the seasons that governed the flooding of the rivers. To them, numbers were sacred, not tools of calculation but symbols of harmony. A circle of 360 degrees represented completeness because it echoed the movement of the heavens. The temple, built according to those ratios, was a miniature universe, balanced, perfect, in tune with creation. The idea that the universe was structured according to measurable order was not new even then, but the Sumerians gave it a shape, a vocabulary of bricks and light. When sunlight struck the temple walls at the right angle, it illuminated carvings of gods stepping down ladders of flame or water, metaphors perhaps for descent, but rendered with an eerie precision. The gods did not float or drift. They moved along pathways of light, the same paths traced by the stars. The temple was designed to mirror those movements, to invite them. Some texts describe the summit chambers of ziggurats as shining places where the gods rested their feet upon the earth. The imagery suggests that the topmost level was not a shrine in the ordinary sense, but a platform of contact, a place designed for the descent of divine presence. That idea persisted for thousands of years, echoed in every altar raised high, every sanctuary open to the sky. The physical act of ascending mirrored the spiritual act of calling down. In the soft darkness before dawn, when the air cooled and the horizon began to pale, the priest waited at those heights, believing they stood at the threshold between worlds. Even the materials chosen carried meaning. The lower layers were built of clay, the substance of the earth and humanity. The upper levels were often finished with bitumen, copper, or glazed brick, materials that gleamed under sunlight, reflecting the heavens. In this combination of earth and brightness, the builders captured a metaphor that did not need words. The gods might dwell above, but their reflection lived below. The temple's surface shimmered like the sky's mirror, an invitation written in light. To modern eyes, these alignments may look like superstition, but they represent one of the earliest unions of science and spirituality. Observation of the stars required patience, discipline, and mathematics. The Sumerian astronomer priests recorded the intervals of Venus's disappearance and return with astonishing accuracy. They noted eclipses, charted the moon's phases, and predicted the flooding of the rivers based on celestial signs. They understood that the heavens and the earth were parts of the same system, that what happened above shaped what happened below. It was not faith alone, it was empirical, repeated, verified night after night. The temples became observatories long before the word existed. From their high terraces, the watchers of the sky noted each dawn's subtle shift. When the planet Nibiru, a term later wrapped in mystery, appeared in their records, it was described not as a myth, but as a marker of transition. a crossing point between the paths of the gods. Its appearance heralded great change, both celestial and earthly. The priests recorded its motion as they did the others, embedding its cycle into ritual. Whether Nibiru was a planet, a star, or something else entirely, it was treated as part of the same divine network that the temple sought to maintain. Over time, the language of stone and star became universal. The same principles reappeared wherever people sought meaning in the sky. In Egypt, the temples along the Nile mirrored the course of the river as a reflection of the Milky Way. In the Andes, lines of stone extended outward from sacred centres, tracing constellations above. In China, the imperial observatories aligned palaces to the pole star, symbolising the unchanging axis of heaven. All of them spoke the same silent grammar: proportion, alignment, reflection, rhythm. The beauty of that language is its permanence. Words fade, but geometry endures. Even when the Sumerian tongue fell silent and the names of the gods were forgotten, their alignments remained. The old temples crumbled, but the directions of their foundations still pointed where the stars once rose. When archaeologists uncovered them, they found the same mathematical ratios repeated across thousands of years, as if the stones themselves remembered. There is something profoundly human in this persistence. The builders were not only constructing places to worship, but ways to communicate with the infinite. Each alignment, each shadow traced across a wall at dawn, was a message to whoever might be listening. They believed the universe responded, in flood and harvest, in light and darkness, in the rhythm of days that echoed the rhythm of eternity. Sometimes, late at night, when the sky clears and the stars return to their ancient patterns, you can feel what they must have felt. The same constellations look down as they did 5,000 years ago, silent and steady. Somewhere beneath them lie the remains of the first temples, buried and forgotten, their bricks aligned to those same points of light. The distance between us and them collapses. The language they spoke has no need for translation. The Sumerians may have written their myths on clay, but their truest inscriptions were carved into the landscape itself. Every temple was a sentence, every alignment a phrase, every act of rebuilding another verse in a conversation that has never entirely ended. Through it, they told the heavens that they remembered. They built to be seen, not only by the living, but by whatever might still dwell among the stars. And though the temples have fallen, the grammar remains. We still build towers to measure the sky, still arrange circles of stone to catch the light, still look upward for meaning. Perhaps the Anunnaki taught us more than agriculture or kingship. Perhaps they taught us to read, not with eyes alone, but with alignment, with structure, with wonder. The same knowledge that once guided the builders of Eridu still guides the observatories and telescopes of our time. We are, in a sense, still building temples of light. If you trace that lineage back far enough, through ruins and stories, you find that it all begins with the first ziggurats, those quiet, stepped mountains that rose from the floodplain to mirror the sky. There, in the meeting of earth and starlight, the language of connection was born. A grammar not written in ink or sound, but in orientation and shadow. A dialect of stone and star that spoke to both gods and men in the only voice they could share: geometry. Somewhere deep beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, those patterns still wait. The bricks still face their celestial marks. The horizon still holds the same coordinates. And though the rituals have faded into history, the conversation continues, carried by every dawn that rises over those forgotten foundations. The temples no longer speak aloud, but the sky remembers what they once said. And so the story moves forward, from the shimmering alignments of Nippur to the deeper mysteries of sound and vibration, where stone begins to sing again, and the echoes of the gods seem to return in frequencies too low for words. Sound has always had a way of shaping the world, even before words existed to describe it. Long before the first instruments, before songs and chants and prayers, there was only vibration. the pulse of thunder, the whisper of wind through reeds, the hum that lingers in a quiet room after the last sound has died away. Somewhere in that deep, ancient awareness, humans began to notice that sound could change space, that the air itself could be moulded, that stone could carry tone, that silence could be tuned. And so, in the same way they aligned their temples to the stars, they began to shape them to the hidden music of the earth. The old ziggurats, with their hollow chambers and narrow corridors, were not just monuments to sight, they were built to be heard. The Sumerian temples were often described as houses that speak, not because they were filled with noise, but because sound moved through them in ways that made the invisible seem present. A single voice chanting in the innermost room could ripple through the walls, echoing faintly like a second presence. When drums were struck in the courtyards, the vibrations travelled up the stairways and into the air, mingling with the wind. For those who stood within, the effect must have felt like the gods were answering back. In ancient hymns, the temples are said to roar like bulls, or sing like the storm. To modern ears, those might sound like metaphors, but the acoustic evidence suggests otherwise. When wind passes through openings at certain angles, or when sound strikes a chamber of particular proportions, resonance occurs. The air begins to vibrate, amplifying the tone until the walls themselves seem to hum. The builders of the old world might not have had modern physics, but they had experience. They knew how stone responded, how air could carry feeling. Their temples were built not only for vision, but for vibration. Archaeologists exploring the ruins of Nippur, Ur and Eridu have noticed the strange consistency of those proportions. Rooms where the ceilings curve just enough to reflect sound evenly. Corridors that narrow to a throat-like passage, concentrating and releasing the voice like breath. It is as though each temple was an instrument, each stone a note waiting to be played. In the ancient texts, certain ceremonies are described as the opening of the house of sound. Priests would strike bronze bowls, blow through hollow reeds, and chant in rhythm with the beating of drums. They believed that when the right harmony was reached, the divine presence could move freely between heaven and earth. The sound of a temple filled with those voices must have been extraordinary. The air thick with incense, the firelight flickering against glazed tiles, the rhythmic pulse of music rising through the steps. It would have been both physical and spiritual, a sensory bridge between the seen and the unseen. For the people gathered below, the experience was not about faith alone. It was about feeling, the literal vibration of the divine around them. The Sumerians spoke of the gods descending when the temple was alive with sound. The moment was described as a joining of voices. The priests sang the names of the Anunnaki, and the air trembled with the echoes. The gods replied through thunder, wind, and the deep rumble that filled the space. In that call and response, the separation between mortal and divine seemed to vanish. When later civilizations inherited the form of the ziggurat, they also inherited this acoustic understanding. In Egypt, certain temples were designed so that a single clap would return as a rolling wave of echoes. In the Great Pyramid of Giza, low tones resonate at frequencies that align almost perfectly with the natural vibration of the human body. In Malta's Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, carved long after Sumer, but with the same precision, voices chanting at specific pitches create standing waves that can induce a trance-like state. Everywhere the idea repeats itself, the sacred space as an instrument, the human voice as its key. In the Sumerian world, music was not entertainment, it was order. The same mathematical system that divided time and measured the heavens also governed rhythm and tone. The ancient lyres found at Ur show this beautifully. Their strings were tuned to the intervals of planetary motion, each note corresponding to a celestial body. The musician who played within the temple was not performing for pleasure, but reenacting the structure of the cosmos. Each vibration echoed a pattern of the heavens, restoring harmony to the world below. Some researchers have suggested that the temples themselves were tuned to those same principles. The ratio of height to width, the thickness of walls, the spacing of columns All could determine the frequencies produced when sound passed through them. It is not impossible to imagine that the builders, through centuries of observation, discovered how to create spaces where sound could amplify spiritual presence. The ancient term me, which appears so often in the Sumerian tablets, refers to divine decrees or attributes, but it can also mean the intrinsic powers that sustain creation. One of those powers, they wrote, was music, the vibration that brings order to chaos. Inside the Ekur, the temple of Enlil, certain rooms were reserved for the performance of hymns that could only be sung during particular phases of the moon. The timing was precise, down to the day. When the moonlight fell through the upper openings and struck the inner altar, the priests would begin their chant. The notes would rise slow and steady until the resonance filled the space. To them it was not simply sound, it was an offering in motion. The air itself became the medium of devotion. In later myths, sound and creation are inseparable. The universe begins with a spoken word, a breath, a tone that brings form to the formless. The Sumerians called this the voice of the gods, the command that shaped matter. Their temples were built to recreate that moment again and again, each ceremony a small reenactment of the beginning of the world. When the priests sang, they were echoing the first vibration, the sound that once called everything into being. There is evidence that even the tools used in construction carried this awareness. Some of the inscribed bricks mention blessings spoken over them before placement, as if to infuse them with tone. The sound of the words themselves mattered. The very act of naming gave the brick its strength. The repetition of divine names, the striking of drums, the whisper of wind through corridors, these were not incidental, they were essential. The temple did not begin when it was built. It began when it began to sound. Modern experiments with ancient spaces have shown how deeply this resonance could affect perception. When certain frequencies are sustained, they produce sensations of pressure in the chest and skull, a faint vibration felt in the bones. The boundaries of self seem to dissolve, replaced by a sense of vastness. It is no wonder that the ancients associated such moments with contact from beyond. In the glow of torchlight surrounded by vibrating air, the worshippers must have felt the presence of something immense, something that could be felt but not seen. In the Epic of Gilgamesh there are descriptions of gods whose voices shake the mountains, whose words make the rivers tremble. The parallels to sound's physical power are clear. To speak was to create movement. To sing was to shape reality. The temples amplified that belief, turning the invisible into something tangible. The idea that the gods could be invoked through resonance was not superstition. It was a natural extension of how the world itself was understood. Everything vibrated. Everything sang. The builders may have chosen materials not only for strength but for sound. Mud brick carries low frequencies well. Copper fittings can enhance reverberation. The combination of porous and reflective surfaces creates complex acoustic effects. It's possible that the selection of bitumen, a sticky, resinous substance used to bind bricks, was partly to alter how sound travelled through walls. The choices seem too deliberate to be random. These were not primitive structures, they were sophisticated designs built by people who understood how sound behaves. The deeper meaning of all this goes beyond architecture. Sound was the link between body and cosmos. The human voice could mimic the rhythm of thunder. The pulse of the heart could echo the drumbeat of creation. To chant was to align oneself with that larger pattern. The temples provided the environment for that alignment, a chamber where the vibrations of man could meet the resonance of the gods. There is something profoundly intimate about the idea of divine connection through sound. Unlike light, which travels in straight lines and fades with distance, sound wraps around, enters, surrounds. It moves through matter. It penetrates. To the Sumerians, this must have seemed like proof of its sacredness. The gods could hear because sound could reach them, and perhaps, in the trembling air, they could speak back. When the rituals ended, the echoes would linger. Long after the last drum beat faded, the temple would still hum softly, the air carrying a faint trace of the chant. For those who tended the altars, that lingering vibration was a sign that the presence remained. Silence was not absence, it was continuation. The gods did not depart immediately. They faded slowly, dissolving into the walls, waiting to be called again. Over time, as empires shifted and the temples aged, the understanding of resonance transformed into symbolism. The later Babylonian and Assyrian texts speak of the voice of the temple as an aspect of divine favour. When a city prospered, it was said that its temple was singing. When disaster struck, the temple was silent. The idea persisted even when the gods changed names, even when languages evolved. The relationship between vibration and vitality, sound and divinity, never disappeared. In the distant echoes of these beliefs, you can still hear the foundation of many later ideas. The notion that creation began with sound survives in countless traditions. In Hindu cosmology, the universe is born from the syllable Om, the vibration that contains all things. In ancient Egypt, the god Ptah speaks the world into existence. In the Gospel of John, the opening line declares, "In the beginning was the Word." Each culture found its own phrasing, but the truth remained the same. Before there was light, there was sound. The Anunnaki temples, with their carefully tuned chambers, were among the earliest expressions of that truth. They were not only built to honour the gods, but to communicate with them in the one language all matter understands: vibration. The resonance of stone, the breath of the priest, the rhythm of the drum, all formed a bridge of sound across the invisible divide. The air between earth and heaven became an instrument, and the temple its resonating body. When we think of those places now, we often picture silence, ruins standing lonely under the sun. But in their prime, they were anything but silent. They were filled with motion, with rhythm, with the pulsing heartbeat of devotion. To stand within them was to stand inside a living sound. And even now, if you were to walk among those broken walls as the wind rises, you might still hear it. The faint low hum of air moving through ancient passageways, the same note that once carried prayers to the sky. It is strange how time fades everything except vibration. The music stops, the voices fall quiet, but the frequencies linger, absorbed into the stones. If you listen long enough, you can almost believe that the old songs are still there, just beyond hearing, waiting for the right air, the right echo to return. Perhaps that's why the temples continue to feel alive. Their sound has never completely died. In that sense, the temples of resonance were not just built for the gods, they were built for us. For the need to feel connection not through sight or thought, but through something deeper, more physical, more immediate. The same impulse that led the Sumerians to carve hymns into clay still drives us to fill vast halls with music, to search for harmony in chaos. Sound remains our oldest bridge, our first form of contact with the unseen. And as the story continues, the vibration will carry us further still, down into the moments when the gods themselves seemed to vanish, when the songs grew quiet and the air of the temples fell still. The next age would remember the silence not as an ending, but as a pause, a waiting breath before the sound returned. There came a time, according to the old stories, when the air grew quiet. The wind that once seemed to speak through the temples fell still. The ziggurats, once alive with chanting and firelight, stood cold under the sky. The hymns that had summoned the gods no longer brought answers. The smoke of offerings rose, but no voice came down through it. The priest waited, listening to silence that stretched longer each year, until the people began to whisper that the gods had gone. The Sumerians never described this as abandonment. In their words, it was a withdrawal, a journey, a return to the heavens. The texts say simply, the gods ascended. Yet within those simple words is a deep ache. The rituals continued out of memory, but something essential had shifted. The gods who had built the cities, who had taught men to measure and sing and build, had vanished into the sky. In the old tablets, there are fragments that hint at how it happened. They speak of floods, of wars between divine houses, of disputes over the destiny of humankind. The stories differ, but they share a tone of inevitability. Something had unbalanced the order between heaven and earth. Perhaps it was human ambition. Perhaps it was weariness among the gods themselves. In the myths of Eridu and Nippur, Enlil and Enki argue over the fate of the world. Enlil wishes to cleanse it, to restore purity through destruction. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep water, argues for mercy. What follows is the flood, the event that erases cities, resets time, and marks the end of the First Age. When the waters recede, the survivors build again. They pile clay upon clay, re-establish temples where the old ones stood, and call once more to the heavens. But the world feels different. The air is empty in ways it had not been before. The gods, they say, no longer walk among men. They watch from afar, their voices carried only through dreams and omens. The temples remain, but they are now symbols, not dwellings. Humanity has inherited the earth, but at a cost. The earliest hymns after the flood sound subdued. Where older songs celebrate descent and presence, these speak of remembrance and hope. "Come back to your house," one inscription pleads. "Let your shadow rest again upon the gate." The words suggest that the people did not fully understand why the gods had left. They only knew that their absence changed everything. The crops still grew, the rivers still flooded, but the rhythm of the world felt hollow. In the silence that followed, myth became memory. Priests began to interpret the stories of descent and ascent as cycles, not endings. The gods had not abandoned creation. They had retreated to their heavenly stations, waiting for the appointed time to return. The rituals continued in anticipation. Reenactments of arrival meant to keep the connection alive. Each dawn, the temple doors were open to the east. Each evening, fires were lit to guide invisible travellers through the dark. The architecture itself became a form of waiting. There is an unmistakable melancholy in the texts from this era. In the Lament for written after the fall of the great city, the poet describes the gods leaving their shrines, their footsteps like fading thunder. They have gone, they have flown to the mountains, it says. The house is empty, the gate is silent. The lament is not just for the city, but for the loss of presence. When the gods depart, meaning withdraws with them, the world becomes mechanical, repeating itself without voice or guidance. And yet, in the ruins, hope persists. The scribes record dreams in which the gods appear again, luminous and vast, promising return. The signs of their presence shift from direct encounter to subtle phenomena. The flight of birds, the shimmer of heat, the sudden stirring of wind through still air. The divine moves from the physical to the symbolic. Perhaps that was always the next stage of evolution. Once the gods no longer needed to walk among men, they began to dwell within the mind. There are passages that suggest the temples themselves resisted the silence. The priests wrote that when they entered the sanctuaries at night, they still felt vibrations under their feet, faint but unmistakable. Some believed these were the echoes of the gods' last songs trapped within the stone. They spoke of the resonance continuing underground, of the Abzu still humming. To them, the departure was not total. The gods had left their voices behind, woven into the fabric of the earth. In one story, the city of Eridu falls into ruin after its temple collapses. A priest, alone among the rubble, hears a sound rising from the flooded foundations, a tone like wind passing through copper pipes. He believes it is Enki speaking from the deep, promising that the bond between heaven and earth will one day be restored. That promise becomes the foundation for later faiths, each retelling it in new forms, each waiting for the same return. Across time, the pattern repeats. The Egyptians tell of the time when the gods sailed away in their celestial boats, leaving humanity to govern itself. The Greeks remember the Golden Age, when gods and mortals dined together, and the Silver Age, when the divine withdrew to Olympus. The Hebrews' rite of Eden closed, the divine presence moving into fire and cloud. The Maya recall the moment when the lords of the sky vanished, leaving their temples to sleep beneath the jungle. The story of the gods' departure becomes a universal inheritance, a memory written into every mythology, a shared recognition that the sacred once felt nearer. There is something deeply human in how the Sumerians responded to that absence. They did not renounce the gods or curse them for leaving. They built again, they restored the temples, they continued the rituals even when no voice answered. The act of rebuilding became its own form of faith, a declaration that the connection had not been severed, only delayed. Each new ziggurat was both monument and message. We remember. The priests taught that absence was not the opposite of presence, but its shadow. The gods, they said, had gone because the world needed to learn to sustain itself. The laws, the measurements, the arts of writing and agriculture, these were gifts meant to endure without supervision. The gods had not vanished out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Like teachers leaving pupils to their own lessons, they had stepped back to see what would be made of their gift. In this interpretation, the silence of the temples becomes a test, and the continuing devotion of humanity becomes the answer. Still, one can imagine the feeling of those last days before the departure. The priests lighting lamps that flickered low, the corridors empty, the air still. The night sky above stretching wider than before, the stars colder, more distant. Perhaps the people sensed it before it happened, the gradual thinning of presence, like breath leaving a room. The gods did not vanish in a moment of thunder and light. They faded quietly, like the last sound of a song. For a civilization built on communication with the divine, that silence must have been devastating, and yet it also marked a new beginning. With the gods gone, humans became the keepers of order. The measurements of time, the geometry of temples, the writing of laws, all once divine tasks became human responsibilities. The echo of the divine voice now lived in language, in art, in science. The builders who had once followed the gods' blueprints began to create their own. In this way, the departure of the gods may have been the birth of civilization as we know it. Some later traditions reinterpret this moment as exile. The gods, angered by human disobedience, retreat to the heavens, leaving behind a world fractured and mortal. But the Sumerian tone is gentler. They speak of cycles, not punishment. The gods come and go like the flood, like the seasons, like breath. Their withdrawal is part of the rhythm of the cosmos. The temples are built to endure that rhythm, to wait patiently until the tide turns again. There are accounts that describe how the priests tried to summon the gods back. They would climb the ziggurats at dawn, facing the rising sun, and chant the ancient names. They burned cedar and juniper, believing the smoke could carry words upward. They sang the same hymns used in the days of descent, repeating the tones that once opened the gates. And sometimes, in the stillness after the last note, they claimed to see light moving across the sky, or hear a faint resonance from the earth below. These moments were recorded as omens of hope, signs that the connection had not been completely lost. Even after the great flood myth faded into legend, the idea of divine departure remained central to the human story. The temples of later ages, from Babylon to Thebes, were filled with imagery of gods returning, winged discs, beams of light, figures descending in glory. Each new age seemed to anticipate the same reunion, reshaping it into its own faith. The Anunnaki may have left the earth, but their pattern of coming and going became the blueprint for all theology that followed. The silence of the gods also changed the way humans perceived the world around them. Without constant divine intervention, natural phenomena became mysteries to be studied. The regular motion of stars, once signs of divine will, became the basis of astronomy. The cycles of rivers and seasons, once interpreted as moods of the gods, became systems to measure and predict. In seeking to understand what the gods had left behind, humanity began to imitate them. The divine departure transformed worship into curiosity, faith into observation. But deep within the rituals, the longing remained. Even when science replaced mythology, even when observation replaced prayer, the old instinct continued, to listen for what had once been heard, to rebuild what had once been lost. Every observatory, every telescope, every probe sent into the sky is, in some quiet way, another temple of remembrance. Each one asks the same question the Sumerians asked at the base of their ziggurats. Where did the gods go, and will they ever return? When night falls over the ruins of Eridu or Ur, it is easy to imagine that the answer still lingers in the air. The wind moves across the broken bricks, carrying a sound that is almost like breathing. The stars shimmer faintly above the horizon, unchanged since the first priests watched them. In the silence, there is a sense not of emptiness, but of pause, as if the gods are still listening from afar, waiting for the right note to call them back. Somewhere in that stillness, humanity learned to hear itself. In the absence of divine voices, the human voice grew stronger. The stories, the songs, the architecture, all became echoes of what had once been divine speech. The gods may have departed, but their resonance continued, carried by the people who refused to forget. The temples, even in ruin, remained the centre of this remembrance. They stood as anchors in time, reminders that contact had once been possible. Every reconstruction, every repair, every rebuilding was a reaffirmation of that faith. The Sumerians may not have known if the gods would return, but they built as if they would. In doing so, they preserved the bridge between heaven and earth, even if only as memory. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the gods who left, the gift of continuity. In teaching humans to build, they ensured that their own story would never end. Each wall that rose from the dust carried their fingerprints. Each melody that echoed in the air carried their tone. Even in departure, they left instructions, written not in words but in the rhythm of existence itself. And so, through silence and time, through flood and empire, the waiting continued. The temples stood patient under sun and storm, their stairways leading nowhere visible, their altars open to empty air. Yet beneath the dust, the resonance lingered. Somewhere, deep in the earth, the hum of the Abzu still moved. Somewhere, above the sky, the gods still watched the signal flicker upward. The distance between heaven and earth had grown vast, but the pattern remained. The bond could not be broken, only stretched. The Sumerians understood this better than most. In their eyes, the gods had not died or disappeared. They had simply stepped back into the horizon, into the same stars their temples had always faced. And as long as those stars continued to rise and set, the connection endured. The silence of the gods, then, was not an ending but a threshold. The world waited on one side, the heavens on the other, the temples standing between them like open doors. The songs would begin again someday, when the time was right, when the vibration returned. Until then, the builders and the dreamers kept their watch, holding the memory in stone, waiting for the air to sing once more. The story of Eridu begins where the rivers meet, in a land of marsh and light, where the air smells of water and clay. The Sumerians said it was the first city, the foundation of all others, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. To them, Eridu was not just a settlement. It was an axis, a point of connection, a sacred experiment in linking the human and the divine. Every civilization needs an origin, a place where heaven once touched the earth, and for the Sumerians that place was here, near the edge of the Persian Gulf, where fresh and salt waters mingled in a shimmer of blue. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Eridu, they found layer upon layer of building, each older than the one above, each centered on the same spot. A temple built, destroyed, and rebuilt again through centuries. 20 successive temples stood there, one on top of another, like geological strata of faith. At the lowest level, beneath the later constructions, they found the faint outline of the oldest sanctuary, a small shrine of reed and clay. simple yet deliberate, aligned to the rising sun. It was here, according to the texts, that Enki first came down from the heavens and established his house, the Abzu, the home of the deep waters. The Abzu was not a mythic realm somewhere beyond the earth. It was believed to lie beneath it, an invisible sea under the soil, the source of all fresh water and life. To dig a well was, in their eyes, to pierce the skin of the world and touch that sacred ocean. Enki was its master, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. His temple at Eridu was built directly above this hidden source, marking the point where the unseen flowed into the seen. It was not only a temple, it was a gate. The idea that a gate could exist beneath a city might sound like a legend, but in the logic of Sumerian cosmology, it was perfectly reasonable. The world was layered: heaven above, earth in the middle, the Abzu below, and the underworld deeper still. Between each layer were portals, guarded and sealed, yet passable for those who knew the right words, the right tones, the right offerings. The temple at Eridu stood directly over one of those thresholds. When the priest poured libations into the ground, they were not symbolically honouring the god. They were feeding the waters that flowed beneath, sustaining the connection between realms. In the old hymns, the temple is called Eabzu, the house of the deep. Its walls, they said, gleamed like lapis lazuli. Its doors opened onto a shining pool where sacred fish swam and reeds whispered in the wind. Within it were chambers where the divine decrees, the me, the blueprints of civilization were kept. Those who entered could feel the coolness of the air, the faint tremor of the water below. It was said that Enki himself could rise through that water when summoned, appearing not as a distant light but as a presence moving through the mist. For the Sumerians, the Abzu was both literal and symbolic. It represented the origin of life, the wellspring of wisdom, and the memory of the god's arrival. To build above it was to mark the spot where heaven and earth once met through the element of water, the fluid that connected everything. They imagined that deep below their feet, channels of sacred current ran through the earth, carrying the essence of the divine. The temple at Eridu was the point where those currents surfaced, the mouth of the underworld sea. Later generations tried to understand what the Abzu really was. To some, it was geological, a vast aquifer that sustained the region. To others, it was spiritual, a metaphor for the collective unconscious, the source of dreams and intuition. But to the Sumerians, it was simply real. They heard it in the bubbling of springs, saw it in the glimmer of wells, felt it in the flooding rivers that renewed the land each year. The earth was alive, and its blood was water. The god who governed it lived below, waiting to rise. There are stories that describe how certain priests could descend into the Abzu. They were called the diviners of the deep. Through ritual and trance they entered chambers below the temple, half flooded, lit by oil lamps that reflected off the water. There they would listen for the murmurs of the god, interpreting ripples and echoes as messages. When they returned, they brought with them visions, patterns of stars, fragments of songs, instructions for the building of canals and cities. These experiences were recorded on tablets, preserved as revelations. The gate beneath Eridu, in this sense, was not a physical doorway, but a state of transition. Those who entered it passed from the visible world into the unseen, from surface to source. The ritual may have been half meditation, half engineering, a descent into cool darkness to attune the mind to the vibration of the earth. Whatever it was, it left a deep impression on those who performed it. The words they used to describe their experiences are the same ones later used to describe journeys into the afterlife. The underworld and the Abzu overlap in meaning. Both are places of origin and return, of dissolution and renewal. As centuries passed, the myth of Eridu grew. It became the archetype of sacred cities, the model for every temple that followed. Even when new gods rose to prominence, Anu, Enlil, Marduk, the memory of Enki's gate persisted. Babylon's great ziggurat, Anunnaki, was said to stand where the Abzu once opened. The Babylonians built artificial lakes and underground chambers in imitation of it, filling them with water to represent the deep. The idea of the gate beneath the city spread across cultures, appearing as the sacred pools of Egypt, the holy springs of Greece, the cenotes of the Maya. Everywhere, the divine was imagined as rising through water, through darkness, through the depths that lie just beneath the surface. The association of water with knowledge also endured. In one version of the myth, Enki, jealous of the power of Enlil, released the Mi, the divine laws of wisdom, into the world through the waters. The rivers carried them to other lands, spreading civilization. The flood that followed was not a punishment, but an awakening. From the gate beneath Eridu, knowledge flowed outward, unstoppable. Even after the gods withdrew, that current remained, a hidden network of sacred memory moving under every city built since. The Abzu was also a place of refuge. When the flood came, the texts say, Enki sealed himself within its depths, preserving life and order until the waters receded. From there he sent dreams to warn humanity, guiding a chosen man to build a vessel and survive. The pattern of that story would echo through later ages. The flood of Utnapishtim, the Ark of Noah, the ship of Deucalion. Always there is the same image, a descent into chaos, a survival guided by divine wisdom, and a rebirth that begins at the water's edge. Archaeologists exploring Eridu have found evidence of wells and channels carved beneath the temples, some reaching deep into the earth. Whether they were symbolic or functional, their presence is striking. The builders clearly intended to connect the sanctuary above with the waters below. Perhaps the rituals that once took place there were more than metaphor. Perhaps the priests really did descend into chambers where the sound of underground water echoed like distant thunder, where the flicker of lamplight turned ripples into patterns of gold. In that half-lit world, the distinction between myth and experience would blur. In one fragmentary text, Enki speaks from the depths, addressing the priests above. My words flow through the water, my voice is the spring. It is not hard to imagine how that line might have been inspired by the echo of sound in subterranean halls. When a chant reverberates through water-filled space, the reflection is otherworldly, distorted, deep. To the listener, it would sound like a reply. This connection between sound, water, and divine presence may explain why the rituals of Eridu emphasized music and vibration. The drums and lyres were not simply for ceremony, they were instruments of communication, tools for resonating with the hidden layers of the world. The priests played their instruments above the gate so that the tones could travel downward, merging with the hum of the Abzu. In that union, they believed the voice of Enki would rise again, joining their song. It is difficult, standing in the dry silence of the ruins today, to imagine the place as it once was. The marshes have retreated, the rivers changed course, the air carries dust instead of mist. But in the imagination, one can rebuild it. The temple rising from the reeds, the sound of frogs in the night, the reflection of torches on still water. Beneath it all, the hidden gate, the well that never dries, the cool breath of the deep earth. For those who lived there, that was the true heart of the city, the place where the boundary between human and divine dissolved into reflection. Some modern writers have wondered whether the myths of the Abzu might have roots in something even older, a memory of contact with knowledge that seemed to come from beneath the world, perhaps from an earlier civilization or from sources we no longer understand. They see in the description of glowing waters and voices from below a metaphor for communication with forces beyond the ordinary. Whether literal or not, the symbolism endures. The gate beneath Eridu represents the passage from ignorance to understanding, from the surface of life to its hidden foundation. Even in later religious thought, the echo remains. The Christian idea of baptism, the cleansing descent into water to emerge renewed, mirrors the journey into the Abzu. The same pattern repeats in countless traditions: immersion, transformation, emergence. Water becomes the medium of passage, the element that remembers everything. The gate beneath Eridu was the prototype for all these rituals, the first threshold through which life passed to meet the divine. There is another detail, easily overlooked in the oldest hymns. They say that when Enki left his temple, he sealed the gate with a song. The phrase has puzzled scholars for generations. Perhaps it means that he closed the passage with a vibration, a tone that only the initiated could recreate. In that reading, the gate still exists, buried but resonant, waiting for the right sound to open it again. If the temples were instruments, as the earlier myths suggest, then the gate beneath Eridu might still be part of that ancient resonance, silent to us, but not inert. To the Sumerians, nothing divine was ever truly gone. The gods could withdraw, but their essence remained in the places they had touched. Eridu, as the first city, carried more of that essence than any other. Even when it fell into ruin, its location remained sacred. Later kings built shrines there, not to rule, but to remember. They poured offerings into the ground, whispering prayers to the waters below. "May the deep hear," they said, "may wisdom rise again." The imagery of a gate beneath the earth has haunted human imagination ever since. It appears in myths of the underworld, in dreams of hidden passageways, in stories of tunnels leading to realms of light. The idea that beneath the surface of the world lies another more ancient one, a mirror, a reservoir of lost truth, feels universal. Eridu may be the first recorded version of that dream, but it is not the last. The yearning to find the hidden gate is as old as memory itself. If you could stand there now among the scattered bricks and silent mounds, you might feel a strange quiet that is not emptiness but potential. The ground itself seems to wait. The air, when the wind is still, carries a sense of expectancy, as if listening. Perhaps the gate has never closed entirely. Perhaps it only sleeps. The people who first built Eridu believed that every river, every well, every pool was connected to the Abzu. The whole world to them was threaded with invisible channels of sacred water. Every drop carried memory. When they poured libations, they were sending messages through that network, trusting that somewhere, beneath the surface, the god would hear. The idea is simple but profound. Communication through flow. Connection not by sight or sound, but by continuity. And maybe that is what the gate beneath Eridu really symbolises. Not a doorway to another world, but the realisation that everything is already connected. The rivers, the stars, the breath, the sound, the thought, all part of a single circulation. Enki's realm was not below us in space, but beneath us in awareness, the foundation that supports everything visible. To reach it, one must descend, not into the ground, but into depth. In that sense, the gate beneath Eridu is still open. Every time we look inward, every time we listen for the quiet hum beneath thought, we are standing where the Sumerian priests once stood, at the edge of the sacred spring, waiting for wisdom to rise. The temple may be gone, the marshes long dry, but the connection remains, invisible and enduring, running through the veins of the earth and through the silence that follows every sound. And so the story moves onward, following that hidden current as it flows outward, across oceans and ages, to other lands where other builders raised their own gates of stone, echoing the same pattern. The journey continues from the deep waters of Eridu to the farthest corners of the world, where echoes of the same design appear, carrying the same quiet promise that what begins in one place never truly ends in another. If one could lift the map of the world like a sheet of paper and trace the old lines beneath it, there would be a pattern running from the floodplains of Mesopotamia across oceans and mountain ranges, a geometry too faint to see but too deliberate to be coincidence. The story that began in Eridu did not end there. It drifted outward with the rivers, carried by traders, sailors, wanderers and dreamers who followed the stars. The shapes they built, The myths they told and the ways they turned their gaze upward all carried fragments of that first pattern, echoes of the temples that once called the gods down to earth. The Sumerians were not the only ones to build mountains from dust. In the Nile Valley, hundreds of miles west, another civilization rose on the same principle, that the divine could be reached through architecture. Their temples too faced the sun, their stairways to climb toward heaven, their stone walls marked by the same ratios of proportion that define the ziggurats of Ur and Nippur. It is difficult not to see the symmetry. In Egypt, the pharaoh's pyramid was his stairway to eternity, his own Ekur, the mountain that binds heaven and earth. The Nile, like the Tigris and Euphrates, was a gift of the gods, flooding with the rhythm of the stars. The priests of Heliopolis charted that rhythm just as the Sumerian astronomers did, marking solstices and equinoxes, aligning their temples so that the first light of dawn would strike the sanctuaries of Re and Osiris with mathematical precision. The languages were different, the names changed, but the grammar remained the same. Heaven above, earth below, the temple between. It is tempting to think that ideas travelled directly, carried by migration or trade, but perhaps it is something deeper. Perhaps once the connection between heaven and earth was demonstrated, it echoed in human minds everywhere. Civilization itself seems to follow the same rhythm. The building of order, the alignment with the stars, the attempt to anchor meaning in stone. From the plains of Sumer to the deserts of Egypt, the story unfolds with uncanny familiarity. Gods descend, teach, depart. Humans remember, build, and wait. If we follow the pattern further east, the trail leads to the Indus Valley, to cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, where the people built on grids that mirrored celestial geometry. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, an enormous pool surrounded by steps, seems almost like an echo of the Abzu, a reflection of the sacred water that once flowed beneath Eridu. The emphasis on purity, water, and order suggests the same instinct, the same inherited reverence for the elements that connect heaven and earth. Even their seals, carved with symbols of bulls and serpents, recall the animals sacred to the Mesopotamian gods. Beyond the mountains in the lands of China, the same ideas appear under new names. The temples and altars of early dynasties were aligned to the pole star, the axis around which the heavens turned. The emperor, called the Son of Heaven, ruled as the mediator between realms. His palace stood at the centre of a symbolic universe, its halls and courtyards mirroring constellations above. The language of stone and star had crossed into a new dialect, but its structure was unchanged. Everywhere, the sacred meant alignment, balance, resonance. The temple was never just a building, it was a model of the cosmos. As the centuries passed, the same impulse appeared again and again, taking on forms that suited new landscapes. In the jungles of Mesoamerica, long after the Sumerians had faded into dust, the Maya and the Olmec built temples of stepped stone rising from green canopies, their summits crowned with shrines where priests watched the heavens. The serpent god Kukulkan descended the staircase of Chichen Itza in light and shadow each equinox, a moving pattern of brilliance and darkness that mirrored the Sumerian imagery of gods descending on beams of light. In their myths, too, the sky beings came down, taught the calendar, the writing, the cycles of the stars, and then vanished, promising to return. It is almost as if the same conversation continued across the ages, spoken in different accents. Each civilization rediscovered the same grammar of divinity, the notion that contact with the heavens could be maintained through architecture, orientation, and sound. The builders of Stonehenge, thousands of miles away, raised their circle of stones to mark the turning of the solstice sun, aligning heaven and earth just as the Sumerian astronomers had done. The stones stand like a frozen chorus, their placement reflecting a deep understanding of celestial rhythm. Even the islands of the Pacific carry whispers of this pattern. The people of Easter Island carved enormous stone figures, their backs to the ocean, their faces turned inward toward the land as though guarding a sacred axis. Some of the statues are aligned to stars, others to points on the horizon that mark equinox or solstice. Though separated by vast oceans, the principle repeats: to mark, to align, to connect. In the high plateaus of the Andes, the builders of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku raised temples of precision-cut stone that defy modern explanation. Their blocks are carved with interlocking joints so fine that a knife blade cannot pass between them. Some walls align with celestial events, others form acoustic chambers that hum when the wind moves through them. The mythologies of the region speak of sky beings who descended from the heavens, bearing knowledge of building and agriculture, then departed to the stars. It is a story too familiar to be ignored. When scholars try to explain these parallels, they often invoke coincidence or universal human curiosity. But the alignment of so many cultures around the same principles, geometry, astronomy, sound, suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests memory, the kind of memory that outlives language, surviving through instinct and imitation. The memory of a time when communication between heaven and earth was not symbolic but real. Perhaps what began at Eridu was not just a city but a template, a cosmic architecture repeated again and again by those who felt the same pull toward the sky. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the towers of Mesoamerica, all are variations of the same form, adapted to different lands and materials but carrying the same message. Each stands at the threshold between worlds, a declaration that humanity remembers where it came from. In every place where the pattern appears, the myths tell the same sequence: a descent of teachers, a gift of knowledge, a sudden departure, and a promise of return. The Anunnaki have many names: the Shining Ones, the Sky People, the Children of the Sun, but their roles never change. They bring the order of heaven to the chaos of earth. They teach humanity to measure, to build, to write, to speak. Then they vanish, leaving behind stone monuments that imitate their own descending paths. The parallels deepen when one looks at the myths of water and sky. In Egypt, the god Thoth emerges from the primordial sea to bring writing and wisdom. In the Andes, Viracocha rises from the waters of Lake Titicaca to create mankind. In the Pacific, Tangaroa, the god of the deep, sends his children to bring life to the islands. The same pattern flows through them all. Wisdom rising from the depths, a divine presence moving through water, a gate between worlds that opens only at the dawn of creation. These are not random similarities. They are variations of a single ancient story told by different shores. Even the tools of measurement seem to carry traces of shared origin. The geometry used to align pyramids and ziggurats, the ratios found in their dimensions, the constant appearance of the same sacred numbers 60, 12, 3, and 30 echo across continents. These numbers define not only time but proportion, sound, and distance. They are the fingerprints of an old design, one that humanity has followed unconsciously ever since. Some have wondered whether this repetition points to a lost civilization, a progenitor culture that once spanned the globe, destroyed by flood or fire, leaving only fragments for later peoples to rediscover. It is an idea that has haunted thinkers from Plato to modern archaeologists. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria. The names change, but the longing behind them remains the same. They all describe a world before the world we know, a time when the divine and the human lived in harmony. The ruins that dot our planet may be its memory, faint but enduring. If that idea feels impossible, it is worth remembering how much knowledge has vanished in the ordinary course of time. Civilizations rise, build, and fall, their achievements buried beneath centuries of earth. A few tablets, a few broken walls, a few myths survive, and from them we reconstruct a vast and complex story. Perhaps the pattern we see, the repetition of temple mountains and cosmic alignments, is the fossil of something once whole, the skeleton of a forgotten unity. The language of stone transcends translation. It carries intent without words. A temple aligned to the stars is not a coincidence, it is a statement. The same statement written across continents becomes a conversation, one that may have begun long before our written history. To follow that conversation is to move backward through layers of time, listening for the same rhythm that once guided builders across oceans they did not yet know existed. If the Anunnaki temples were stargates, then perhaps these global structures are their reflections. Scattered doorways built by those who remembered the sound of the original. Each new culture, rediscovering the principle, built its own version in the hope of reopening the channel. The ziggurat became the pyramid became the stepped temple, the temple became the mountain shrine. Each sought the same goal, to bring heaven closer. It is possible that the knowledge of the original builders spread not through travel, but through resonance, the way a single tone can cause another object to vibrate in sympathy, even from far away. Perhaps the ancient world was connected through ideas that moved like sound through air, carried by shared intuition. The first temples might have set a pattern that echoed through human consciousness, inspiring others to replicate the design without knowing its source. When night falls on the ruins of the world, on Giza, on Teotihuacan, on Angkor, on Nippur, the stars still rise in the same order. The light that once guided the Sumerian priests still falls on the same stones. It is easy to imagine that each site, no matter how distant, is part of the same network, each one aligned to a different note in the great chord of the earth. Seen together, they form something like music, a planetary harmony, ancient and unfinished. Standing among those ruins, it is impossible not to feel that they are speaking to one another across time. The air hums faintly with shared geometry. The same shapes repeat, the triangle, the circle, the spiral. The same measurements recur, angles that point to stars, ratios that mirror planetary motion. Even the myths that surround them overlap, as if drawn from a common source. Each one remembers the gods who came down, the knowledge they gave, and the promise that they would one day return. Perhaps that is why so many ancient cultures built not only for the present, but for the future, for those who would come after, for those who would find the stones and recognize their language. The temples were messages written in endurance, meant to outlast floods, wars, and silence. They are in a way the world's oldest archives, preserving in architecture what could not be kept in speech. If the flood of Sumer washed away the first chapter, then the rest of human history has been its echo, the gradual rediscovery of what was lost. Across oceans and ages, the same desire has persisted, to rebuild the link between heaven and earth, to restore communication with the unseen, to stand once more beneath the open sky and feel that it is listening. And so the pattern continues. The ziggurats of Sumer give way to the pyramids of Egypt. The temples of the Maya rise where the stars burn brightest. The builders of Angkor align their towers with the constellation of Draco. The Incas shape their city of Cusco in the image of a puma, the symbol of strength and guardianship. Everywhere, the same equation. Heaven mirrored on earth. It is not a coincidence that so many of these structures are tied to sound, to vibration, to resonance. When the gods departed, humanity may have lost direct contact, but not the knowledge of how to call across the distance. The stones still answer. When wind moves through their corridors or footsteps echo through their chambers, they hum with the same frequencies that once summoned the divine. The song continues, faint but persistent, flowing through the veins of the earth like the waters of the Abzu. What began beneath Eridu did not remain there. It spread quietly, not as conquest or migration, but as memory encoded in architecture, number and sound. It is the inheritance of the builders, passed from hand to hand, from one shore to another, until every corner of the world carries its reflection. The gods may have departed, but their pattern never did. It travelled across oceans, across ages, woven into the stones themselves, and wherever we find those stones, standing silent beneath the same sky, we are reminded that the story of contact is not a myth of one people, but the shared origin of us all, a memory written not in words but in geometry, resonance, and light. There are stones that seem to remember things. They do not speak, but they hold a silence that feels intentional, as though they are waiting for someone who can still hear what they once said. Across deserts and jungles, on cliffs and plains, their shapes rise out of the earth like fragments of memory, aligned so precisely with the heavens that it is difficult to call it coincidence. Even when their builders are forgotten, the stones keep looking upward, as if they have not stopped listening to the sky. The first time one stands before such a monument, there is a strange stillness that settles in the chest, a recognition that these are not random piles of rock, but instruments tuned to something far beyond human time. The light touches them in deliberate ways. At dawn or dusk, shadows stretch in patterns that match the movement of stars. The edges of blocks align with the solstice sunrise. The walls point to the horizon where certain constellations rise. They were built, it seems, to hold a conversation between heaven and earth. The Sumerians believed that the gods built with stone for this very reason. Clay was mortal, but stone remembered. When Enlil's temple fell, the myths say its stone still hummed with his presence. The Ekur, even in ruin, was called the body that endures. That phrase repeats in later cultures, in Egypt, in Greece, in the Andes. Stone endures because it retains the vibration of what it has witnessed. It absorbs the sound of ceremony, the rhythm of prayer, the weight of light, and keeps them. In the mountains of Lebanon, at a site called Baalbek, lie stones so vast that their presence defies explanation. Each block weighs hundreds of tons, carved and moved with a precision that modern machines would struggle to achieve. The temple that once stood there was dedicated to Jupiter by the Romans, but the foundation is far older than their empire, older perhaps than recorded history. The lower stones fit together so perfectly that even after thousands of years, no blade can pass between them. Their alignment points not to Rome, but to the stars. The locals call them the stones of the gods. Some legends claim that this was once a landing place, a foundation built to anchor the descent of the divine. Whether myth or metaphor, the feeling of it remains when you stand before them, the sense that something immense once rested there. Far to the east, in Anatolia, lies the site of Göbekli Tepe. When it was unearthed, it rewrote the timeline of civilization. 12,000 years old, it predates writing, agriculture, and cities, yet its builders carved pillars taller than a man, covered in reliefs of animals and symbols whose meanings remain unknown. The stones form circles that align with the stars of Cygnus and Orion, the same constellations sacred to the Sumerians millennia later. Each pillar faces a specific point on the horizon, as though the structure itself was built to observe the skies turning. It is the earliest known temple, and it already carries the same pattern: alignment, resonance, reflection. No one knows who built Göbekli Tepe, or why it was buried soon after completion. Some believe it was hidden deliberately, preserved for a future age. Others think it was abandoned when its purpose was fulfilled. But when you stand among those pillars, carved with the care of a culture that should not have been capable of such sophistication, it feels less like an anomaly and more like a memory resurfaced. The same geometry that defined Eridu appears here, impossibly ancient, as if the knowledge of the gods had survived the floods and found new hands. The same can be said for Puma Punku, high in the Bolivian Andes. The air there is thin, and the light is sharp, falling cleanly on stones cut with machine-like precision. The blocks are of andesite, a material almost as hard as granite, shaped into interlocking forms that suggest an understanding of engineering long before modern tools. Some fit together with millimetre accuracy, forming joints that seem designed to resist both time and earthquake. The alignment of the site follows the solstices, and its orientation matches constellations visible only from that latitude. The stones themselves seem to hum in the cold wind, a low tone that carries through the ground. The local myths say the site was built by the god of the sun in a single night, using sound to move the stones. The detail is remarkable: sound, vibration and movement, the same triad that defined the temples of the gods in Sumer: Baalbek, Göbekli Tepe, Puma Punku. Each stands at a different edge of the world, and yet each carries the same signature: massive stones, impossible precision, astronomical alignment, ritual resonance. They are not copies of one another, but variations on the same chord. Perhaps each was built where the memory of the old connection felt strongest, places where the resonance of the gods still lingered in the earth. There is an old belief, found in many traditions, that the world itself is alive, and that certain places act as nodes, points where energy flows more freely between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called them Duranki, bonds of the sky and the underworld. The Egyptians spoke of them as sacred points, the Hindus as tirthas, crossings between worlds. The megaliths and temples seem to mark those same points, each one aligned not only with the stars but with the unseen currents of the planet. To modern ears this may sound like mysticism, but the physical evidence suggests that ancient builders were sensitive to the earth in ways we no longer are. Many of these sites lie on fault lines or magnetic anomalies. Instruments detect variations in electromagnetic fields near them, fluctuations that can affect human perception. The ancients did not have compasses or magnetometers, but they had intuition. They could feel where the Earth's pulse was strongest, and they built there, amplifying it through stone. The temples became resonant structures, not only with sound, but with the subtle energy of the ground itself. The Sumerians believed that their gods descended in places of power, spots where the veil between realms was thin. The same idea echoes across continents. The Egyptians built on the Giza Plateau because they said it mirrored the heavens. The Mayans chose high plateaus where lightning struck most often. The Greeks built Delphi on the fissure of a sacred spring. In each case, the location came first, as if the builders were responding to something already there. The stones were not arbitrary. They were instruments placed in tune with the landscape. Over time, these sacred sites became the skeleton of the world's memory. Even as empires changed, the locations retained their sanctity. New temples rose atop old foundations. New names replaced ancient ones, but the pattern persisted. In Baalbek, the Romans built over a site that was already ancient in their day. In Jerusalem, the Temple Mount stands where older shrines once were. In Mexico, the Spanish built churches on the ruins of Aztec temples, sometimes aligning them unintentionally with the same celestial paths. The stones, it seems, remember their orientation even when the builders forget. Perhaps that is what is meant when people say that stones remember the sky. Not that they store light or sound, but that they preserve alignment. Their faces, their edges, their foundations are locked into the same geometry. The heavens follow. When the stars shift, the stones remain, holding the memory of where they once were. The earth turns, civilizations fall, languages vanish, but the monuments stay faithful to the pattern. They're archives of alignment, frozen music from an age when the world was still in tune. In some places that harmony can still be felt physically. At Stonehenge, when the midsummer sun rises, its light threads perfectly through the archways, striking the heart of the circle. The air fills with a warmth that seems deliberate. The same happens at Chichen Itza, where the serpent of light glides down the pyramid steps. At Abu Simbel, deep in the Egyptian desert, sunlight penetrates the temple's inner chamber only twice a year, illuminating the statues of the gods at precise intervals. These effects required an understanding of the heavens so exact that even a single miscalculation would have broken the spell. The builders did not guess, they knew. It is possible that these alignments were not meant merely to mark time, but to invite something, a conversation, a reawakening of the old link between heaven and earth. The gods had departed, but the stones could still call to them. The geometry of these places was like a language the sky could understand. Each sunrise, each shadow, each echo was a message written in light and vibration. The gods might not have answered directly, but the builders kept speaking anyway, trusting that the act of remembrance was itself sacred. When modern eyes look upon these structures, they often see mystery or impossibility. How could primitive peoples have lifted such stones, cut them with such precision, aligned them so perfectly without advanced tools? But the question may begin in the wrong place. The builders might not have been primitive at all, or perhaps they were using knowledge that did not originate with them. If, as the old texts claim, the first temples were taught by beings who came from the sky, then the same blueprints could have spread far beyond Sumer, surviving the flood and the collapse of ages. The people who raised Baalbek, who carved Göbekli Tepe, who shaped the stones of Pumapunku, may have been continuing a design far older than their own civilizations. The myths of the world seem to agree. The gods who came down taught the arts of building, astronomy and measurement, then vanished. The people, left with their instructions, kept building, repeating the shapes that called the gods to return. Over time the knowledge became fragmented, symbolic, ritualized. The builders remembered the form but not always the function, yet the stones kept their purpose. They waited, aligned, facing the sky. There is an image in many cultures of gods turning to stone. In Mesopotamia, fallen gods became the mountains themselves. In Polynesia, ancestors hardened into sacred rocks. In Japan, spirits were said to dwell in stones that shone faintly at night. These legends may not be metaphors for transformation, but memories of presence, of the divine crystallizing into the world's foundation. To build in stone was to invite permanence, to bind the unseen into matter. If one walks through the ruins of an ancient site at night, when the tourists are gone and the wind is the only sound, the sensation is unmistakable. The air feels thick, charged, as if memory itself has weight. The stars above mirror the outlines below, constellations matching the ground plan. The stones, cold and silent, seem to hum faintly, a vibration too low to hear but not too low to feel. It is not imagination. It is resonance, the same phenomenon that once filled the temples of Sumer, now echoing through time. The idea that stones remember is not only poetic but literal. Scientists have found that minerals can store magnetic information, capturing the orientation of the Earth's field at the time they were formed. In that sense, each rock is a tiny archive of time and energy, a record of the planet's own rhythm. The ancients may not have known the science, but they felt the truth of it. When they said a stone was sacred, they meant that it held memory. When they built with stone, they were writing permanence into the world. Across oceans and ages, the same intuition guided every builder. To reach the divine, one must build in the language of the earth. Clay speaks of mortality, wood speaks of transience, but stone speaks of eternity. It is heavy enough to anchor heaven, it listens, it remembers, and so the stones still stand remembering. They remember the light that once struck them at perfect angles. They remember the chants that filled the air. They remember the gods who descended to rest upon their surfaces. They remember the people who lifted them, shaped them, prayed among them, then vanished. They have outlasted everything but the sky. Some nights, when the air is clear, it feels as though the stones are still in dialogue with the stars. The constellations shift slowly, their positions changing over millennia, but the stones do not move. Their alignment becomes a bridge between what was and what is. Through them, we can measure not only time, but memory, the patience of matter, the persistence of intention. Perhaps that is what the ancients wanted, to ensure that even if every word was lost, the world itself would remember. The temples of the gods may have fallen, the names of the builders may have faded, but the geometry remains, written in shadow and sunrise, in the angle of each block, in the hum of wind through cracks. These are not ruins, they are sentences still being spoken, and as the journey continues, following the echoes of those alignments, the story begins to turn inward again, from the stones that remember to the minds that decipher them, from the mythology of the gods to the mathematics of their creation, where numbers and proportion form the quiet bridge between myth and science, between what was believed and what might still be true. When the world was young and numbers were new, people did not count for trade alone. They counted to understand the rhythm of things, every cycle of the moon, every return of the flood, every season's breath was measured not just to mark time, but to glimpse the pattern behind it. The priests of Sumer were the first mathematicians not because they loved abstraction, but because they believed that numbers were divine speech, the code by which the gods had written the universe. To them, mathematics was not invention but discovery. They did not believe they were creating a system. They believed they were uncovering one that already existed, set in place when heaven and earth were divided. The gods had shaped the cosmos in measure and proportion, and the act of counting was humanity's way of learning to read the language of creation. To calculate was to remember. The base of 60, which governed their mathematics, was more than convenience. It was sacred. 60 was the number of Anu, the Sky Father, whose domain encompassed all others. His sons, Enlil and Enki, held numbers of their own, 50 and 40, and the other gods followed in sequence. The pantheon was numerical, structured like a celestial equation. The divisions of time and space reflected divine hierarchy. There were 60 minutes in the hour because the heavens themselves turned by that measure. The circle, divided into 360 degrees, was not geometry alone, but cosmology, a reflection of the orbit of the stars, the perfection of the whole. In the temples, these numbers became the blueprint for construction. The ratio of height to base, the spacing of steps, the alignment of gates, all followed the same principles. The builders did not simply measure distances, they invoked harmonies. When a temple was completed, it was said to be in tune with heaven, balanced in proportion as the cosmos was balanced. The mathematics of the divine was not cold calculation, it was devotion rendered in form. Every number carried meaning. 1 was unity, the origin of all things, the moment before division. 2 was separation, heaven and earth, male and female, light and darkness. 3 was creation, the joining of opposites into something new. 4 was the foundation, the 4 directions, the 4 winds. 5 marked the hand, the human ability to act. 6 reflected completion, as in the 6 days of labour before rest. 12 was cosmic order, the number of constellations and months, the wheel of the year turning endlessly. Numbers were symbols of process, steps in the unfolding of existence. In the myths of Sumer, even the gods used numbers to create. When Enki shaped the rivers, he divided their courses in measured lengths. When Nana, the moon god, traced his path across the sky, he did so in precise intervals. Each day of the month a segment in a perfect arc. The stars moved by law, not by whim. To break that order was to invite chaos. To live within it was to share in the divine. Over time, the priest began to see that these numerical harmonies existed everywhere, in music, in architecture, in the proportions of the body, even in the cycle of dreams. They developed the first systems of weights and measures not to simplify commerce, but to preserve balance. To build a wall or shape a vessel was to mirror creation on a smaller scale. Each act of crafting was an echo of the god's own work. When they mapped the heavens, they found numbers hidden in light. The planets moved with predictable slowness, their cycles forming patterns that repeated over decades. The priests recorded these intervals with obsessive care, marking every return of Venus, every conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. They noticed ratios, the time it took for one planet to orbit compared to another, the way those ratios matched intervals in music. The harmony of the spheres, a phrase the Greeks would later use, already existed in Sumerian thought. The cosmos was a song written in numbers, and the temples were its instruments. The ziggurat itself was a mathematical statement. Its tiers rose in geometric progression, each smaller than the one below by a fixed proportion. The number of steps, the height of each level, the angle of ascent, all encoded meaning. To climb it was to ascend through the numerical order of creation, from the square of earth to the circle of heaven. The summit represented unity restored, the reconciliation of all divisions. When later civilizations inherited this knowledge, they expressed it in their own ways but kept the same foundation. The Egyptians used sacred ratios to design their pyramids. The Great Pyramid's dimensions formed the relationship between the circle and the square, between the earthly and the divine. Its slope encodes the constant p, and its proportions echo the golden ratio, which would not be named until millennia later. Whether by accident or inheritance, the mathematics of the gods persisted. In Greece, Pythagoras would claim that all things are number, that harmony is the structure of existence. His theorem, known today as a geometric principle, was once a spiritual one, the recognition that form follows law, that balance is the signature of truth. When a lyre string vibrates in perfect ratio, it produces consonance. When architecture follows those same ratios, it produces beauty. To the ancients, these were not metaphors but literal truths. A temple that pleased the gods was one that resonated mathematically with their order. Even in distant lands, the same understanding emerged. The builders of Angkor Wat laid out their temple complex according to celestial ratios, its towers mirroring planetary distances. The architects of Chichen Itza calculated the movement of the sun with such precision that shadows formed living symbols on the equinox. The Incas arranged Cusco as a vast coordinate system, its streets aligned to stars and solstices. Everywhere, sacred geometry bridged the human and the divine. The persistence of this pattern raises a quiet question. How did so many civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, discover the same mathematical truth? Some say it was coincidence, the inevitable outcome of human observation. But the repetition is too exact, too intentional. It is as though the knowledge was not learned but remembered. A trace of something older, passed through ritual and intuition, encoded in proportion rather than language. The Sumerian tablets describe numbers not as abstractions but as beings. The gods themselves are called lords of measure. In one hymn, Enlil is praised as the counter of the heavens, while Nana measures the night with silver light. The act of counting was sacred because it imitated the divine mind, which ordered chaos through division. Every line drawn, every measurement taken was a participation in creation itself. Mathematics, in this ancient sense, was a bridge of empathy. To know the proportions of the cosmos was to feel its heartbeat. The builders of temples were not simply engineers, they were translators, converting divine ratios into matter. When the temple aligned perfectly with the stars, when its stones resonated with the correct frequencies, it was said that heaven could dwell within it. The numbers were the key that unlocked presence. Even sound was governed by these same ratios. The length of a string, the size of a drum, the spacing of flutes, all corresponded to mathematical intervals. When played together in proper relation, they produced harmony, a state the ancients equated with health and balance. The sick were treated with tone. The mind calmed through repetition of measured rhythm. In this way, mathematics extended beyond architecture and astronomy into the soul itself. Over time, this understanding became mythologized. The gods who ruled the heavens were imagined as musicians and architects, shaping reality with sound and proportion. Enki's voice was said to ripple through water in perfect measure. Thoth's staff divided light into time. Apollo's lyre tuned the world to its proper key. These were not artistic embellishments but symbolic truths, describing the same process through different imagery. The divine created through mathematics, and the human imitated creation through understanding it. In the ruins of Sumer, The oldest mathematical texts are not practical manuals but incantations. They begin with prayers to the gods of number, asking for clarity, balance, precision. To calculate was an act of devotion. Each correct sum honoured the harmony of the universe. Each mistake was a small breach of order. Even the scribes who tallied grain did so under the gaze of divine arithmetic, believing that fairness in measure pleased the gods. There is a quiet elegance in this worldview. To them the world was not random but designed, not mechanical but musical. The flood, the drought, the turning of stars, all part of a grand equation, sometimes hidden but always coherent. The task of humanity was not to control it, but to understand it, to move within it like a dancer keeping time with the music. The temples of the gods were not towers of pride, but metronomes, ensuring that the rhythm of heaven continued through the ages. Even now, when we look at the remains of those ancient structures, their mathematics speaks more clearly than their myths. The angles of Giza, the alignments of Stonehenge, the geometry of Teotihuacan, these are expressions of the same law that governed Eridu's first shrine. They form a lineage of logic older than any written record, a silent continuity of proportion that binds us to the builders of the dawn. Modern science, in its own way, has come to the same conclusion. The orbits of planets follow predictable ratios. The frequencies of atoms correspond to musical intervals. The structure of crystals mirrors the geometry of sacred art. Everywhere, the same patterns repeat. Symmetry, balance, rhythm. The universe is still written in number. The ancient intuition was correct, even if their gods have changed names. There is a passage in a Babylonian tablet that reads, "The gods measured the waters, and so they stilled them." The line may refer to irrigation, but it carries a deeper meaning. Measurement brings peace. To understand proportion is to bring harmony to chaos. When the priests traced lines in the sand to plan their temples, they were not merely mapping foundations, they were calming the world. Perhaps that is why the mathematics of the divine has never fully disappeared. We still seek it, whether in the equations of physics or the symmetry of art. The impulse to measure, to align, to find order in complexity is as old as the first temple brick. Each formula written today is a distant echo of the Sumerian priest tracing numbers into clay under torchlight, whispering the names of the gods as he counted. If the Anunnaki taught humanity anything, it was that creation follows law. The divine does not act through chaos, but through pattern. To understand that pattern is to come closer to divinity itself. The priests of Sumer knew this long before modern minds rediscovered it in the stars and atoms. They believed that every structure, every melody, every human thought was a reflection of cosmic arithmetic, and so the mathematics of the divine remains not only in stone, but in us. In the rhythm of the heart, in the cadence of breath, in the proportion of limb and voice. We are built to the same ratios as the temples, tuned to the same harmonies as the stars. The numbers that shape galaxies also shape the beating of blood. The ancients sensed this without knowing the terms. They lived it instinctively, measuring their lives against the rhythm of the cosmos. Even now, when we look at the night sky, measuring distances in light years and plotting orbits with precision, we are continuing the same act. We are counting the heavens just as they did, seeking the same understanding they once called divine. The instruments have changed, but the intention has not. To measure is to remember that there is order in the infinite, and perhaps, if we listen closely, the old harmony still plays, the song of numbers moving through matter, the quiet pulse of the world keeping time with the stars. It has never stopped. It only waits for those who can still hear it, who know that mathematics at its core is not cold logic but reverence. The language of the gods is not lost, it simply speaks now in other forms. The builders of Eridu would have understood. For them, every calculation, every alignment, every brick laid in proportion was an act of faith. Faith that the world is knowable, that the heavens respond to reason, that creation itself can be read like a tablet of numbers carved into eternity. They measured not to control, but to belong. They counted to join the rhythm of the divine, and the rhythm continues. It carries through temples, through stars, through atoms, through minds. From the mathematics of the gods to the equations of men, the pattern endures, unbroken, infinite, turning silently through time. The same old conversation between heaven and earth, written now not only in stone but in everything that exists. Behind every monument that still defies explanation, behind every block of impossible weight and every perfect angle cut into stone, there were hands that shaped the world to divine instruction. Yet those hands are almost entirely forgotten. The builders of the temples, the craftsmen who carved and lined the earth to the will of the heavens, left almost nothing of themselves. Their names were not written on tablets, their faces were never painted on walls. They existed between myth and memory, known only through the precision of their work. The gods were praised for the design, kings were remembered for the order, but the engineers, those who made the invisible become tangible, vanished into the dust. The ancients called them the Shiddim, the skilled ones. Others called them the servants of the gods, or the keepers of measure. They were men and women who carried in their minds the sacred mathematics of the divine, who understood proportion, leverage, and sound, who could turn a command spoken by a priest into a structure that touched the stars. Without them, the temples of the Anunnaki could never have risen. And yet, they are absent from the records, as if their silence was part of the covenant. The earliest depictions of builders show them working with instruments that seem too advanced for their age, sighting rods, plumb bobs, levelling cords stretched across vast foundations. They measured by the stars, laying out grids that aligned perfectly with celestial points. They carved channels for water that flowed without interruption. They shaped blocks that fit together with such precision that even after millennia of earthquakes the joints remain intact. To modern engineers, the feats appear impossible without metal tools or advanced machinery. To the Sumerians, it was not impossible, merely sacred. The work itself was a form of worship. In the texts that survive, there are hints of guilds, secret schools of geometry and construction. The House of Builders, mentioned in one damaged tablet, is described as a place where apprentices learned the laws of lifting, the song of the stone, the measure of the heavens. It suggests a discipline that combined mathematics, music and ritual, as though engineering was as much an act of invocation as it was of calculation. The students did not merely learn how to move matter, they learned how to listen to it. When the priest spoke of resonance, the builders understood it literally. They knew how sound could ease the shifting of stones, how vibration could loosen or align. Later myths transformed this knowledge into legend, tales of priests levitating blocks with songs, of stones that floated through air when the right tones were sung. Perhaps these are exaggerations of real techniques, lost to time. The builders likely knew how to use rhythmic motion and synchronize sound to move heavy loads, the way armies chant when lifting or rowing to create a unified rhythm of force. To them, this was not magic, but physics, though the boundary between the two did not exist in their minds. In the construction of the great ziggurats, these forgotten engineers faced challenges that would test even modern skill. They worked without cranes or pulleys, without iron or steel. They relied on geometry, balance, and knowledge of materials. The mud bricks were baked in stages to achieve uniform strength, the foundations layered to absorb the movement of the earth. Some temples rose more than 20 stories high, their stairways sweeping upward in precise alignment with celestial axes. The air shafts that ran through them provided ventilation, but also carried sound. The builders must have known how air pressure and echo would behave inside such spaces, how to make the temple itself breathe. Their methods remain obscure because they did not record them as manuals. Knowledge was transmitted orally, guarded by initiation. To be a master builder was to hold secrets given, they claimed, by the gods themselves. Those secrets were not written because they were considered sacred property, not human invention. The belief that construction techniques were divine gifts persisted through time. In Egypt, the god Thoth was credited with teaching the geometry of pyramids. In Greece, Hermes was called the architect of the cosmos. The lineage of knowledge was always upward, never human. The builders were channels, not creators, but if one looks closely at the surviving evidence, there are traces of their presence, quiet but unmistakable. The alignment marks carved into the stone at Girsu, the chalk lines still visible beneath the plaster of Babylon's walls, the sequence of numerical ratios etched into the thresholds of Eanna at Uruk, all speak of human minds working with immense care. These are not accidents of intuition, but the signatures of precision. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. There are tablets that describe offerings made to the masters of measure after the completion of a great work. They were given bread, wine, and a blessing to rest in the shadow of the foundation they raised. Their anonymity was not neglect, but reverence. To name them would have been to draw attention away from the divine order they served. The gods were the architects, the builders were the instruments. To remain unnamed was to remain pure. Still, one wonders where they came from. These first engineers, who seemed to know more than their age should have allowed. The myths answer in the only way they could. The gods taught them. The Anunnaki, descending from the heavens, revealed the measures of the world, the lengths of rope, the divisions of time, the numbers that govern form. Enki himself was said to have drawn the first plan in clay, a design that became the blueprint for all temples. From that first act of divine drafting, all human architecture was born. The tablets describe Enki's temple at Eridu as being built by hands not human, its corners aligned to the stars by eyes that see in darkness. Some take this as myth, others as memory of a forgotten technology. Perhaps the earliest builders inherited designs from an earlier age, from survivors of a cataclysm who still remembered the old geometry. Each generation after that may have lost a little more until the techniques became legend. The builders themselves may not have understood the full origins of their craft. They only knew that what they built connected heaven and earth, and that their duty was to preserve that connection. In later centuries, the memory of the builders survived under different names. In Egypt, they became the followers of Imhotep, the first architect, whose genius elevated stone into eternity. In Mesopotamia, they became the craftsmen of Marduk, constructing temples in the likeness of the stars. In Greece, they were the dactyls and cyclopes, divine smiths and masons. In medieval lore, they became the keepers of sacred geometry, the invisible lineage that eventually gave rise to the idea of the architect as philosopher. The chain of transmission is long, but it begins with the same hands that lifted the first brick at Eridu. One striking feature connects all ancient engineering, an obsession with foundation. The builders of the old world began not by raising walls, but by finding the exact point where the structure would touch the earth. They called this point the navel, the place where heaven's pattern meets the world's surface. To locate it, they used the stars, aligning by night, marking shadows by day. Only when the foundation was perfectly placed did they begin construction. The process was ceremonial. Offerings were buried in the corners, symbols of the four directions. A small pit was dug at the centre, filled with water to represent the Abzu, the deep. The first stone was laid beside it, connecting the structure to the hidden flow beneath. It is easy to imagine these scenes. Teams of workers gathered in the dawn light, priests murmuring hymns, the builders measuring with cords of flax stretched between poles, marking each point with pegs. They moved slowly, deliberately, aware that each measurement echoed the divine ratios above. When the first brick was set, a trumpet sounded, and the people rejoiced. But behind the ceremony, the builders remained silent, focused on angles, loads, and alignments. They were the quiet custodians of accuracy. As temples grew more complex, so did their techniques. The builders experimented with arches, domes, and columns that could support immense weight while maintaining proportion. They learned to channel water through stone, to vent smoke through hidden shafts, to use bitumen and copper to bind and strengthen. Some of their methods were so effective that they remain visible today, untouched by time. The The ruins of Ur still stand, partly because the engineers of that age understood the chemistry of their materials. The bitumen they used to waterproof foundations was mixed with mineral salts that harden like resin. When modern archaeologists tried to remove it, it resisted even modern solvents. These were not primitive artisans. They were experimenters, observers and theorists, though they would not have used those words. Their craft was a dialogue with matter. They studied the way clay cracked in the sun, the way stone fractured under pressure, the way sound moved through hollow chambers. Every observation became part of a greater understanding of how to translate divine proportion into the physical world. They were scientists in an age that had no science, engineers before engineering had a name. It is tempting to imagine that their knowledge was limited to the physical, but the surviving structures suggest otherwise. Many temples exhibit acoustic phenomena that could not have been accidental. The chambers of the great ziggurat at Ur produce standing waves at frequencies that match those of human resonance. The voices of priests chanting inside would have been amplified, enveloping listeners in sound. The builders must have designed it intentionally, knowing how shape influences vibration. Whether they thought of it as acoustics or spirit does not matter. They knew how to make stone speak. In a way, that was their true legacy. Not the monuments themselves, but the principle behind them. To shape the material world according to invisible laws. To use measure and ratio to mirror the divine. To create permanence through understanding. That idea passed quietly from temple to temple, from civilization to civilization, long after the names of gods changed. The forgotten engineers became the hidden thread of human progress, the silent bridge between myth and science. Some scholars argue that they were the true keepers of the ancient knowledge, that the wisdom attributed to gods was preserved by guilds of builders, coded into architecture and passed on through design rather than text. If that is true, then every ancient monument is a kind of library, each wall and angle a sentence written in geometry. The priests may have spoken of heaven, but the builders wrote it into stone. When one walks through the ruins of an ancient site, there is often a feeling of coherence that cannot be explained by age alone. The scale, the symmetry, the balance, all evoke calm, as if the stones themselves follow a logic that the body recognizes before the mind does. That sensation may be the legacy of the forgotten engineers, their language of proportion still resonating with the human nervous system, tuned to the same mathematics as the cosmos. Even without knowing why, we feel the rightness of it. The builders understood that feeling better than anyone. As centuries passed, their art became ritualized. Their secrets were hidden in symbolism, their tools turned into emblems of mystery. By the time of Babylon, the House of Builders had become a priestly order. Geometry and divinity were one. To measure was to pray, to align was to honour the gods. The last of the true engineers may have been those who built the final ziggurats, completing a lineage that began with Enki's first plan in the clay of Eridu. When their world ended, their knowledge scattered with it, absorbed into legend, reinterpreted by later cultures, waiting in the shadows of myth for rediscovery. And yet their presence endures in every stone that still stands against time. The precision of their hands speaks more clearly than any inscription. They did not need to be remembered because their work was designed to outlast memory. Every line of symmetry, every flawless angle, every perfectly laid foundation is a whisper of their mind still alive in matter. They are gone, but their thought persists, embodied in architecture that continues to defy decay. Perhaps that was always their intent, to let the work speak for them, to ensure that long after their names were forgotten, the structures would still point to the heavens, still remind the living that the world was once measured in harmony. They may not have known we would one day walk among their ruins, measuring, photographing, wondering how such things were done, but they knew someone would come. They built for that moment as much as for the gods. They built for eternity's curiosity. Somewhere beneath the dust of old cities, beneath the foundations of modern towns, their fingerprints remain pressed into bricks. The pattern of their rope marks, the precision of their cuts, the hidden geometry of their foundations, all traces of a knowledge that has never truly vanished. We have given it new names, clothed it in new theories, but the essence is the same: to understand the universe through form, to speak the language of measure, to translate the invisible into matter. The forgotten engineers of Sumer were the first to do this on a grand scale, and every civilization since has followed their blueprint. They taught the world that to build is to remember, that every stone placed in order is a prayer to permanence. The gods may have departed, but their builders ensured that the memory of creation would remain visible, etched into the earth itself. And as the story moves onward, through the silence of time, it follows the remnants of those designs into later ages, into the hands of those who copied their ratios, who revived their symbols, who sought to decode what they left behind. The next age of builders would no longer remember the gods' voices, but they would still feel the pull of the same geometry. They would inherit the plans without understanding their origin. They would rediscover, piece by piece, what the forgotten engineers once knew, that to shape the world in harmony with heaven is to bring the divine within reach once more. If you stand before the ruins long enough when the air stills and the sun drifts low, you can almost feel the vibration beneath the surface, a pulse that seems older than the stones themselves. There is something in them that hums, not in sound but in presence, as if the structure remembers a function it no longer performs. For centuries, people have looked upon these remains and asked the same question: were they merely temples, or were they something more? Beneath the dust of Eridu, beneath the terraces of Ur, beneath the ziggurats and pyramids scattered across continents, the same idea has endured, that once the gods walked among men not through faith, but through passage, that their temples were not symbols but gateways. The myth of the Stargate is as old as civilization. It begins in Sumer, in the stories of the Anunnaki descending through beams of light, their ships shining like the stars. The Sumerian word for gate, dur, appears often in their texts, usually paired with the word Anki, meaning heaven and earth. Duranki, the bond of heaven and earth. In the hymns to Enlil, it is said that his temple in Nippur was the binding post of the sky, a place where the doors of the gods opened and closed. The phrasing is mechanical, not poetic. The gods travelled by means of doors. Those doors stood upon the earth. To the people of that age, this was not metaphor. When they spoke of the gods descending, they described it with the same precision they used for floods and harvests. The texts record brightness upon brightness, rays that burn the sky, chariots of fire resting on temple platforms. The air trembled when the gods came down, and the earth shook when they left. The priest who witnessed these events described them not as visions but as occurrences, recorded alongside weather, stars, and wars. The line between myth and report was not yet drawn. Over the centuries, as memory turned into legend, the description softened into symbol. The doors of the gods became sacred metaphors, the light became revelation, the tremor became awe. But the older versions, pressed into clay, retain a bluntness that feels different. They speak as if describing technology in the language of faith. The temple was not simply a place of worship. It was an interface. In the epic of Enlil and the Lord of Arata, the two kings compete through the favour of the gods. Enlil, ruler of Uruk, builds a great temple to Enki, and boasts that through it the word of the god travels to the mountains. He speaks of sending a message through the temple itself, a statement that sounds strange until one realises that temples were designed around acoustics and alignment, capable of channeling sound and light in ways that would have seemed supernatural. The builders understood resonance. They built spaces that could amplify and project vibration. Perhaps the word of the god travelling was not metaphor, but the literal transmission of frequency. The myth of the Stargate may have begun here, not as a science fiction vision, but as an ancient understanding that the temple could connect realms through vibration and geometry. To the Sumerians, the divine did not live in another universe, but in another frequency. The temple, when tuned correctly, was the bridge. Archaeologists studying the ruins of ziggurats often note their peculiar orientation and layered design. Each tier narrows in precise ratio, forming a stepped spiral when viewed from above. The pattern resembles a coil or vortex, the same shape that governs natural flows, from water draining in a basin to galaxies rotating in space. The builders may not have known the physics of this, but they understood the principle: movement through rotation. The ziggurat was both mountain and spiral, a solid embodiment of ascension. When priests climbed it, chanting in rhythm with each step, they enacted the motion of ascent through vibration. The topmost chamber, often open to the sky, was called the place of descent. It was not a room for congregation, but for encounter. The god, they said, descended upon it as upon a platform of radiance. The word Mu appears in several inscriptions, sometimes translated as name, sometimes as skyboat. In one tablet it is written, "The Mu rose above the house, shining like daylight. The god entered his Mu and ascended." The same term appears in later Akkadian texts as Sham, meaning celestial object. Whether these were poetic descriptions or memories of something seen, the consistency is striking. The gods arrived in radiant vessels, and the temples were their stations. As the idea spread beyond Sumer, the language of gates persisted. The Egyptians called their portals Seba, doorways of the stars. In the Book of the Dead, the soul passes through 12 gates of the underworld, each guarded by a deity of light. The Mayans spoke of Kinich Ajor, lords of the sun who travelled through gates of fire in the heavens. The Persians imagined a stairway of flame connecting earth and sky. Everywhere, the gods are depicted not descending randomly, but moving through specific passages, as though the heavens were a network of routes, and temples were the terminals. Modern interpretations of these myths often divide into two camps: the literal and the symbolic. Some see the Stargate as a technological device, perhaps a machine that once bridged dimensions or transported matter. Others view it as an allegory for consciousness, the inner passage through which humans can contact the divine. Yet in the worldview of the ancients, these were not opposites. To them, matter and spirit were continuous. The gate between worlds could be both physical and metaphysical. A temple could resonate at the same frequency as the heavens, allowing passage not through machinery but through harmony. There is a recurring theme in Sumerian and Akkadian hymns. The gods come and go through the shining doorway. The doorway is described as trembling, ringed with fire, a wheel within light. The imagery sounds strangely modern: circular portals, rings of energy, vibration. Some scholars dismiss this as coincidence, but the convergence of description across time and culture suggests that the ancients were describing a phenomenon too consistent to ignore. The doorway of light might not have been metaphorical at all. In Eridu, the earliest temple was built over the Abzu, the subterranean gate to the waters of creation. In later myths, Enki's chamber within the Abzu contained a portal to the heavens, a connection between the depths and the stars. The imagery of descent and ascent, of water and fire, repeats endlessly: a gate beneath, a gate above. The gods travelled both ways between heaven, earth and underworld, through channels that mirrored each other. The same geometry governed all: spirals, circles, gates within gates. The temple, standing between, was the hinge upon which the worlds turned. When the gods departed, the gates were said to close. The hymns become laments. The door of the Shining One is sealed. Its light no longer falls upon the earth. Yet even after the gates fell silent, the belief persisted that they could reopen. Priests maintained rituals to keep the alignment intact. Each solstice, each lunar cycle, they performed the same ceremonies that once accompanied descent, in the hope that the connection might return. The ziggurat, the pyramid, the temple, all were built not only as memory but as waiting devices. In later ages, the myths were reinterpreted through new languages but retained the same structure. The Hebrews wrote of a ladder reaching to heaven, angels ascending and descending. The Greeks told of Olympus, where the gods came and went in shafts of light. The Hindus spoke of vimanas, flying palaces that travelled between worlds. The Norse described Bifrost, the rainbow bridge connecting realms. Beneath every version lies the same geometry, a passage of light, a vibration of movement, a bridge between frequencies. Perhaps the most haunting echo of this myth appears in the later Babylonian texts, where Marduk, the great god of order, builds a gateway through which the stars themselves may travel. It is called the Gate of the Gods, Babilu, the origin of the word Babylon. The city was not merely a place of power, but a literal axis mundi, a location believed to contain the central portal of the cosmos. The idea that a gate once stood there, connecting Earth to the divine realm, is embedded in the very name of the civilization. Even when the language changed, the meaning remained. Some modern researchers have suggested that the architectural forms of temples were not only symbolic but functional, designed to interact with electromagnetic and acoustic forces. The combination of specific materials, quartz, copper, water, could generate subtle fields of energy when exposed to sound or vibration. The ziggurats, with their layered brick and bitumen, might have been natural resonators, amplifying frequencies from the earth or sky. To the ancients, such phenomena would have appeared miraculous, confirming the presence of the divine. The gate, then, was not a portal in space but a resonance in energy, a bridge of vibration connecting two states of being. If one imagines the temple as a vast tuning fork, its structure vibrating in harmony with the earth, then the ritual acts, chanting, drumming, burning incense, become forms of modulation. Each ceremony would adjust the temple's resonance, bringing it closer to the frequency of the gods. When alignment was achieved, contact occurred, not through vision or voice, but through immersion in a field of energy that dissolved the boundary between mortal and divine. That experience, passed down through myth, became the story of the Stargate. In a deeper sense, the myth may reflect humanity's oldest intuition, that contact with the divine requires alignment, not ascent. The gate is not above but within, an opening created when the human mind, the temple of flesh, vibrates at the same rhythm as the cosmos. The builders of Eridu understood this instinctively. They built their temples not to reach the sky, but to bring heaven down into matter. Each brick, each ratio, each vibration was part of that act of summoning. Even now, when we gaze at the ancient monuments and feel that strange pull, that quiet awareness that they were more than dwellings for prayer, we may be responding to that same frequency. The geometry of the temple speaks to something in the nervous system, a resonance that bypasses reason. The myth of the Stargate survives not because of fantasy, but because it mirrors a real phenomenon. The way pattern and vibration can alter consciousness, the way harmony can open doors that logic cannot. The priests of the old world did not separate science from spirit. For them, every measurement was sacred, every sound a bridge. When they built a temple, they were not constructing a building. They were recreating the architecture of the universe. To step inside was to enter a microcosm of creation, a model of the heavens brought down to earth. Within that harmony, the gods could manifest, because everything within the temple was built to mirror their realm. The gate opened through imitation. If such knowledge once existed, if the temples of the Anunnaki were indeed built as points of contact, as instruments of resonance that bridged heaven and earth, then the myth of the Stargate is not a fantasy of technology but a memory of science indistinguishable from faith. The builders understood the laws of nature as sacred principles. They did not invent devices, they constructed harmony. The gate was not a machine, it was a state. Perhaps this is why the myth has never faded. It appears again and again, clothed in new language, wormholes, portals, light bridges, but always the same idea. Connection through alignment. The ancients called it divine descent. Modern minds call it physics. Both are attempts to describe the same mystery, the crossing between worlds, whether of matter or of mind. In the silence of the ruins, one can almost imagine the gate still waiting. The stones, aligned to forgotten stars, hold their angles precisely, as if expecting a signal that never came. The air moves differently there. The shadows linger longer than they should. Something about the geometry feels awake. Perhaps the myth was right. Perhaps the temples of the gods are not dead relics, but dormant instruments, waiting for the right resonance to awaken them again. The ancients said that when the stars return to their original positions, the gates will open once more. The geometry will come alive, the vibration will rise, and the gods will descend as they did before. It is not prophecy but pattern, a cycle embedded in the design of the world. Whether that moment is metaphor or event, no one can say, but the stones seem patient, as if they know that time is irrelevant to memory. They will wait as long as they must, and as the story moves onward, beyond the myth and into the mind of those who still study these ancient forms, it begins to ask what such gates truly meant. Not as technology, but as remembrance, because perhaps the purpose of a gate was never escape, but return, to remind the world that it was never separate from heaven, only out of tune. There are moments when myth begins to look like memory wearing a different face. It changes shape across the ages, but its bones remain the same, patterns of story that repeat like equations, familiar and precise. The ancients may not have called what they knew science, yet their myths are filled with careful observation. They watch the movement of stars, the rhythm of floods, the behaviour of light and sound, and turn those patterns into stories. Beneath the poetry, there is often geometry. Beneath the gods, there is lore. The Sumerians were among the first to treat myth not as imagination, but as a form of explanation. The gods they described were personifications of forces: sky, water, wind, earth, not in abstraction but in function. Anu, the expanse above; Enlil, the air between; Enki, the deep below. Together they formed a complete model of the universe: heaven, atmosphere, and subterranean sea. The stories told of their interactions, their struggles and reconciliations, but what they described was the movement of the world itself, the balance between elements that sustain life. When Enlil sent the storm, it was meteorology rendered in language of reverence. When Enki brought the flood, it was hydrology made divine. For the ancient mind, there was no division between myth and measurement. To describe the action of a god was to describe a phenomenon. The myth was not fantasy, it was memory and metaphor fused. When the priest recorded that the gods spoke through thunder or appeared in brightness, they were not inventing miracles, they were naming patterns of energy they did not yet have words for. Thunder was the voice of the air, lightning was the descent of heaven, sunlight was the eternal fire. In this way, myth became an early form of science, an attempt to understand through personification what could not yet be explained through abstraction. Over time, as language evolved and observation became more precise, the gods retreated behind the patterns. What remained was the structure: cycles, measurements, predictions. The Sumerians measured the year through the movement of stars, dividing it into 360 parts, an early model of celestial mechanics. Their stories of gods warring and reconciling mirrored the visible conflicts of the sky, the conjunctions and oppositions of planets. When Nana, the moon, disappeared, they said he had descended to the underworld. When he reappeared, he had returned from death. What we call orbit, they called myth. To modernize, these stories seem naive, but if one looks closely, there is a remarkable precision hidden within them. The Sumerian calendar aligns with lunar cycles within minutes of accuracy. Their flood myths describe not random catastrophe, but the collapse of river systems after climatic shift, an event now confirmed by sediment analysis. The genealogies of gods follow numerical patterns that mirror astronomical periods. It is not invention. It is data encoded in narrative. The science of myth lies in this encoding, the ability of story to preserve information across generations in a form the mind can remember. Equations can be lost when the clay tablet breaks, but a story can travel through centuries of memory, retold until the meaning reawakens. The myth becomes a vessel, carrying fragments of truth through the erosion of time. When the Sumerians spoke of gods who measured the heavens and bound the world in order, they were describing laws of motion and gravity long before those words existed. In the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld, there is more than theology. It is an allegory for cycles, the waxing and waning of Venus, which disappears below the horizon before returning in radiant light. The goddess strips away her ornaments as she descends, just as the planet loses brightness before conjunction with the sun. When she ascends again, clothed anew, the planet reappears in the dawn. The priests who told the tale were not writing fiction. They were encoding observation. The myth was astronomy expressed through emotion. This fusion of science and story is what allowed ancient civilizations to transmit knowledge without written formula. The narrative carried structure. The symbols held proportion. The myths of creation, the gods shaping the world from chaos, dividing light from darkness, setting the stars in their courses, mirror the actual process of cosmic order that physics now describes. The ancients did not know the terms, but they perceived the pattern. In their language, creation was not an event but a continuous act of balance. Every civilization that followed repeated this method. The Egyptians describe the movement of the Nile through the tears of Isis. The Greeks explained the seasons through Persephone's return. The Hindus spoke of cosmic vibration as the syllable Om, the sound that sustains the universe. Beneath each myth, there is a scientific intuition, a recognition that the world is governed by rhythm and relation, not chaos. The Sumerians were among the first to describe that order through numbers. They saw mathematics not as human invention, but as revelation, the language in which the gods had built the world. The same conviction appears thousands of years later in Pythagoras, in Plato, in Kepler. The geometry that the priests traced in sand to design temples is the same geometry that governs planetary motion. What began as devotion became law. In a way, modern science is the continuation of that same search, stripped of its gods, but not its reverence. The astronomer peering through a telescope, measuring the movement of light across the void, is doing what the priest once did from the ziggurat, observing the heavens to find meaning. The language has changed. The equations are written differently, but the impulse is identical, to connect the human mind with the rhythm of the universe. The distinction between myth and science may therefore be one of expression, not intention. Myth speaks in story. Science speaks in symbol. Both attempt to translate mystery into comprehension. The Sumerian priest described the flood as the wrath of Enlil. The geologist calls it a climatic event. Each is a way of mapping cause and effect, one through emotion, the other through reason. The myth engages the heart. The science measures the pattern. Together they form a complete perception. There are scholars who now study myths not for their moral lessons but for their data. The flood of Gilgamesh, the sinking of lands, the fall of fire from the sky, these stories may record ancient catastrophes witnessed and remembered. The alignment of temples and pyramids may preserve astronomical data across millennia. The story of the gods descending through light could describe phenomena we no longer witness. The past, encoded in symbol, waits for translation. The myth of the Anunnaki itself may have begun as a synthesis of observation and imagination. The Sumerians saw lights moving across the night sky that were not stars, the planets, wandering in deliberate motion. To them, those lights were alive, intelligent, divine. They gave them names, personalities, histories. In time, the story of planetary gods became the story of gods descending to Earth. Myth grew from the projection of celestial order onto human history. the heavens became biography. Yet behind the narrative, the science remains, an accurate mapping of planetary behaviour recorded in language of reverence. Even the structure of the Sumerian pantheon reflects scientific hierarchy. Anu, the sky god, represents the fixed stars. Enlil, the air, corresponds to the atmospheric layer. Enki, the waters below, symbolises the planet's foundation. Their interactions describe energy transfer, heat, wind, evaporation, rain. The myth of their conflict and reconciliation mirrors the hydrological cycle. The ancients were not guessing, they were translating process into personality. In this light, the temples of the gods become laboratories as much as sanctuaries. They were places of measurement, where the positions of stars were observed, where calendars were kept, where geometry was refined. The rituals performed within them were experiments in resonance, testing how sound, structure, and alignment affected the human experience. The boundary between worship and study did not exist. To them, understanding was the highest form of devotion. The science of myth lies in this unity. The separation we now draw between belief and knowledge is a modern invention. In the ancient world, to believe was to know, and to know was to worship. The gods were not external masters, but expressions of law, the mind's way of comprehending forces larger than itself. Myth was not meant to deceive, it was meant to encode. The problem begins only when we forget that language changes faster than meaning. When modern readers approach these stories, they often see contradiction. Gods acting irrationally, worlds created and destroyed in cycles, floods and fires repeating endlessly. But within those cycles lies a deeper truth, repetition as the nature of reality. The universe itself oscillates, expansion and contraction, creation and dissolution. What seems mythic is mathematical. The world breathes, and the ancients told that breath is story. In the same way, the myth of the Stargate, the gate of the gods, may describe a genuine phenomenon. Not machines opening wormholes, but the resonance between matter and consciousness, between geometry and perception. The ancients built structures that could amplify experience, induce altered states of awareness, and create the sensation of contact. To them, that was literal communication with the divine. The science behind it is not lost, it has simply been renamed. Today it is studied as acoustics, electromagnetism, neurophysiology. The effect remains the same. If myth is the poetry of science, then science is the prose of myth. One gives meaning, the other gives mechanism. Together they tell the story of a species that has always tried to translate the infinite into understanding. The temples of the gods, the pyramids, the observatories, all are the visible notes of that ongoing symphony. The melody began in Sumer but continues wherever curiosity meets reverence. When the gods departed, as the myths say, the knowledge remained. Humanity inherited the laws but forgot their language. Science is, in a sense, the act of remembering those laws without the names attached. When Newton described gravity, he was rediscovering what the ancients called the bond of heaven and earth. When Einstein wrote of space-time curvature, he was describing the same principle that the Sumerians envisioned as the folding of the divine and the mortal. The vocabulary changed, but the rhythm stayed the same. In that sense, the gods never truly left. They became the laws we study. What was once worshipped as Enlil's breath is now called atmosphere. What was once Enki's wisdom is now called hydrology and chemistry. What was once Nana's path across the night is now orbital mechanics. The myth has not died. It has evolved. The story continues in the language of formulas and observation, still describing the same world. To read the old myths this way is not to diminish them, but to restore their depth. They were not naive attempts to explain the unknown, but early frameworks for understanding the known, models built in narrative form. Their strength lies in their adaptability. A story can carry both science and soul. It can teach facts and meaning at once. That is why these myths survive while so many other writings have faded. They speak to both hemispheres of the mind, logic and longing, measurement and awe. And perhaps that is why the myth of the Anunnaki endures, reappearing in modern imagination as both metaphor and speculation. It reflects our own desire to reconcile technology and transcendence, to find the sacred within the measurable. Whether the gods were beings from the stars or embodiments of natural law, their legacy is the same, the pursuit of knowledge as a sacred act. The temples they left behind are reminders that discovery and devotion were once the same word. The science of myth is not about proving or disproving gods. It is about recognizing that our ancestors saw the world as an interconnected system, animated by rhythm and governed by proportion. They told its story through divine drama because story endures. When we study their myths, we are not reading superstition. We're reading the earliest textbooks of the human species, manuals written in poetry, instructions encoded in reverence. And if we listen carefully, we can still hear what they were trying to say. The flood, the fire, the descent, the ascent, all descriptions of transformation. The gods are the processes, and we are their continuation. The universe is still unfolding through us, still measuring, still seeking order. Every equation we solve, every temple we restore, every sky we map is another verse in the same ancient song. Somewhere within that song lies the original rhythm, the pulse of creation that the ancients called divine. The same pulse that guided the builders of Eridu, the same vibration that filled the temples of the gods, the same resonance that hums beneath the silence of stone. The story of myth and the story of science are not opposites, but reflections of one another, mirrored across the surface of time. Each tries to remember the same truth, that the universe is knowable, and that knowledge, in its purest form, is an act of worship. And so the story moves onward, from the science hidden in myth to the memory hidden in us, to the question of why, across all ages, humanity continues to build, to measure, to look upward, to reconstruct in matter what was once divine. Because perhaps, even after all this time, the gods have not truly vanished. They have simply become the curiosity that drives us to understand the world they left behind. Sometimes when the wind moves through the ruins just right, it sounds like breathing. A slow exhale across the broken stones, a sigh caught between centuries. It is an illusion, of course, yet there is something fitting in the thought that the builders, long vanished, still breathe through their work. The walls that have stood for thousands of years are their lungs, the pillars their spine, the patterns of the bricks their pulse. They no longer have names, but their intent remains intact. It hums quietly beneath everything we have built since. The memory of the builders is not written in books, because their books were the buildings themselves. They spoke in ratios, in angles, in the way light moved through the doorway at a particular moment of the year. Every structure was a sentence, every alignment a phrase, every shadow a pause in the language of matter. We walk through their words each time we enter a temple, a ruin, or a hall whose design still follows their geometry. They were not only craftsmen, they were translators of the cosmos, and their memory lives on wherever form still follows harmony. The Sumerians said that the gods measured the heavens and gave those measures to men, but it was the builders who learned how to use them. They took celestial law and pressed it into clay, into brick, into the curve of the arch and the rise of the stairway. They discovered that to build something lasting, one must build in rhythm with the world itself. It is a principle that has never been lost, only renamed. When an engineer today calculates load and stress, when an architect draws a line according to proportion, they are echoing those same forgotten laws inherited through millennia of imitation. The builders of the old world understood that memory was not only stored in words but in structure. The stones themselves could remember shape and sound. When a temple resonated with a chant, the vibration imprinted itself on the walls. When sunlight passed through an opening at the solstice, it left a trace of order in the dust. Each repetition, each year, each voice reinforced the pattern. The temple was a device for memory, a recorder made of stone and light. When we find it now, weathered and incomplete, it is still replaying what it learned, quietly emitting the frequencies of the ancient world. Some say that architecture is frozen music. If that is true, then the builders were composers working in matter instead of melody. Their harmonies were measured in distance, their rhythms in ratios. They built chords of geometry, symphonies of symmetry. When the priests sang inside their temples, they were tuning the structure as one would tune an instrument. The whole civilization was an orchestra directed by invisible laws, every wall a note, every city a score. We can no longer hear the full music, but its echoes still shape the way we think, the way we design, the way we stand in awe before order. It is remarkable how much of their influence survives in silence. The arches of Rome, the domes of Byzantium, the minarets of Samarra, the cathedrals of Europe, the observatories of India, all carry traces of the same geometry first expressed in Sumerian brick. The knowledge passed not through names, but through hands, through apprentices copying the curves and ratios of their masters. The builders of Babylon studied the ruins of Ur. The masons of Greece studied the temples of Egypt. The architects of the Renaissance measured the ruins of Rome. Each believed they were discovering something new, but they were remembering. The lineage of proportion has no beginning and no end. It is the most continuous thread of human thought. In that continuity lies a strange comfort. Empires collapse, languages fade, gods change, but the geometry remains. The builders may have vanished, but the rules they followed persist like genetic code in our collective craft. Even in the most modern skyline amid glass and steel, the same proportions reappear, the same golden ratios, the same symmetries of form. We cannot seem to escape the memory of the builders, even when we try. Their sense of harmony is embedded in us, inherited not through blood but through practice. The human mind recognizes balance instinctively because the first civilizations built it into our environment. It is difficult to say how much they knew consciously. Did they understand that their work would echo through thousands of years? Or did they simply follow patterns that felt right, unaware of how deep those instincts ran? Perhaps it does not matter. Intent fades, but the effect remains. What they built continues to instruct without words. When a modern architect studies the play of light on ancient walls, when a physicist marvels at the precision of ancient alignments, they are students of teachers who left no books behind. The builders educated the future through example alone. Archaeologists have long searched for evidence of their methods, for the tools they used, for the scaffolding, the calculations, the blueprints. Yet the more that is found, the more elusive their full knowledge becomes. The scale of their achievements seems to exceed the means available. The blocks at Baalbek, the interlocking stones at Pumapunku, the seamless joints of Giza, they defy simple explanation. Each discovery of primitive tools raises more questions than it answers. It is as if the builders worked with understanding beyond their material technology, as though their true instrument was not tool, but comprehension. In their myths, that comprehension was divine gift, the me, the laws of civilization given by the gods. Among those laws were architecture, mathematics, and writing. To possess them was to share in creation itself. The builders were therefore not labourers but initiates. But to build a temple was to recreate the cosmos on a smaller scale, to reassert order over chaos. Each completed structure was a reaffirmation that the world could be understood. Their memory is preserved in that act. The belief that to make something stable in form is to participate in the stability of existence. If one studies their sites from above, the design becomes clearer. The cities align with rivers and stars, their streets radiating from central points like spokes of a wheel. The temples sit at intersections of ley lines, on geological seams or magnetic anomalies, places where energy and water flow converge. It is as though they could sense where the pulse of the earth ran strongest and built to harness it. Modern science can map these flows with instruments. The builders felt them underfoot. They oriented their world to resonance, ensuring that every foundation sat in harmony with the unseen currents beneath. Perhaps that is why their ruins still affect us. Even in fragments, they command silence. The proportions soothe, the scale humbles, the alignment invites contemplation. A ruin does not need to function to communicate. Its geometry speaks directly to perception. We stand among broken stones and feel meaning that transcends language. That reaction is not sentimentality, it is recognition. We are built to respond to the same patterns our ancestors used to shape their world. The builders encoded harmony into matter, and that harmony still reaches us, even when the original purpose is forgotten. In a way, the builders became immortal through their structures. Their names dissolved, but their intention fused with the material of the earth. The clay and the stone hold more than shape. They hold the logic of the human hand guided by comprehension. Each surviving monument is a portrait of thought made solid. We cannot resurrect the builders, but we can read their minds in the precision of their work. The memory of their intelligence lies not in myths, but in measurements. The Sumerians believed that when a temple was finished, the spirit of its builder lived within it forever. To destroy a structure was therefore to kill its creator anew. Perhaps that belief arose from the unmistakable presence that lingers in old buildings, the sense that someone is still there, arranging the light, maintaining the silence. The builders live on in the spaces they made, in the way those spaces still affect the human soul. The resonance they set in motion never truly ends. It fades, it echoes, but it continues. When later generations built their own temples and cathedrals, they unconsciously summoned the same principles. They rediscovered them through practice, guided by instinct and experiment. They may not have remembered the names of the first builders, but they remembered the feeling that a structure must breathe, must balance, must connect heaven and earth. In every age, the craft has repeated that pattern, sometimes in marble, sometimes in mud, sometimes in steel. The materials change, but the formula remains. The memory of the builders is not history, it is reflex. There is a quiet irony in how the modern world, which often prides itself on progress, still depends on the same geometry, the same ratios, the same alignment to light and shadow that guided Sumerian architects. Our skyscrapers rise on ancient mathematics. Our cities still follow grids that echo the old star maps. We have replaced clay with concrete, torches with electricity, yet the design beneath is unchanged. The builders would recognize our world, even if we no longer recognize theirs. In that recognition lies a subtle truth. Memory does not always need awareness to persist. It can survive through habit, through form, through the continuity of beauty. When we find something pleasing in proportion, we are remembering. When we feel calm inside a well-designed space, we are resonating with the same principles that guided the builders of Eridu. The memory of the builders lives in our sense of order, in our unspoken understanding that balance feels like home. Their influence reaches beyond architecture. It extends into the way we think, the way we structure knowledge. The builders taught us that the world can be organized, that chaos can be shaped without being destroyed. Every map, every equation, every system of thought that seeks pattern over disorder descends from that same impulse. They gave us the template not only for buildings but for civilization itself. And yet, their disappearance remains mysterious. No tablets describe where their guilds went, how their knowledge faded, why the art declined. The ziggurats were replaced by palaces, the palaces by walls, the walls by ruins. The builders' lineage dissolved into the general anonymity of time. Perhaps they chose to vanish when their purpose was fulfilled, when their knowledge was no longer sacred but common. Perhaps they merged back into the populations they once served, their memory dissolving into the collective. If so, then their true legacy is not in monuments, but in the permanence of comprehension. Even now, somewhere in the deep strata of thought, that comprehension still guides us. When a bridge holds its weight, When a building stands through centuries, when light enters a space at the right angle to make silence feel sacred, the builders are present. Their memory is not nostalgic, it is functional. It ensures that humanity continues to build in alignment with the same universal order they once mirrored in stone. Sometimes, when the sun sets behind ancient walls, the light glances off in a way that seems deliberate, a final alignment remembered by the stones themselves. For a moment the old geometry returns, and the boundary between past and present dissolves. In that instant, the memory of the builders feels less like history and more like an ongoing conversation, one that continues through every structure we raise. We do not need to believe in their gods to feel their presence. We need only stand in the spaces they created and listen. The hum beneath the silence is still there, the same vibration that once guided hands across clay, that once aligned towers to the stars. It is the sound of understanding made tangible, the echo of those who first decided that to build was to know, that knowledge itself could be a form of devotion. The builders are gone, but they are also everywhere. In the proportions of our rooms, in the patterns of our cities, in the mathematics that govern both. Their memory is not fading, it has simply become invisible, embedded in the very fabric of our world. The Anunnaki may have been gods, but their true immortality lies in the humans who learned from them, who took divine instruction and made it human practice. The builders were the translators of eternity, and their language has never stopped being spoken. The memory of the builders endures because it was never truly separate from us. It is the human desire to understand, to shape, to align. Every new discovery, every structure raised against time, every quiet moment spent measuring and adjusting, all of it is their continuation. They taught the world how to remember through creation, and the world has never forgotten. The stones breathe still, and through them so do we.